life's greatest category, a period so ancient, so alien, and so profoundly important that without it, nothing you see around you today would exist. Not the fish in the sea, not the birds in the sky, not the hand you're using to hold your phone or rest on your desk.
Because the world changed and
Every living thing on this planet traces its ancestry back to the strange, chaotic, breathtakingly creative explosion of biological possibility that took place in the earliest oceans of the world. This is the Forgotten Ocean. Please let us know in the comments where you're watching this history video and what time you're watching it, and be sure to subscribe to the channel for future videos. To understand what happened 500 million years ago, you first have to understand what came before it. And what came before it was almost nothing. For the vast majority of Earth's history, life was invisible to the naked eye. If you had stood on the shore of an ancient ocean 3 billion years ago, you would have seen water, you would have seen rock, you might have noticed a faint greenish or brownish slime coating the stones at the waterline, and that would have been it. That slime was life. Single-celled organisms, mostly bacteria, floating in the water, clinging to surfaces, slowly metabolizing chemicals in sunlight. They had no eyes, no mouths, no limbs, no nervous systems. They were alive in the most basic sense of the word, but they would not have impressed you. They would not have frightened you. You might not have even recognized them as living things. And yet, for roughly 2.5 billion years, this was the entirety of life on Earth. Simple, microscopic, and to all outward appearances, static. The same basic forms persisting across unimaginable stretches of time. Generations upon generations of single-celled organisms living and dying in warm, shallow seas, leaving behind nothing but thin layers of sediment and the faintest chemical traces of their existence. This period is sometimes called the Boring Billion, and while that name is somewhat unfair, important chemical and genetic changes were happening beneath the surface. It captures something true about the visible state of the planet. For over 2 billion years, life looked the same. It did not diversify in any dramatic way. It did not build complex structures. It did not produce anything that would leave a fossil you could hold in your hand and marvel at. It simply persisted. But persistence, it turns out, is not the same as stagnation. Inside those trillions of microscopic cells, something was changing, slowly, imperceptibly, but with consequences that would eventually transform the entire planet. The first major shift was the evolution of eukaryotic cells, cells with a nucleus, with internal compartments, with a level of organizational complexity that bacteria simply did not possess. This happened somewhere around 2 billion years ago, give or take a few 100 million years, and it was arguably the single most important event in the history of life after the origin of life itself. Because eukaryotic cells could do things that bacterial cells could not. They could grow larger, they could specialize. They could eventually cooperate with one another in ways that would lead to the first multicellular organisms. But even after eukaryotic cells appeared, the pace of visible change remained agonizingly slow. Multicellularity itself took hundreds of millions of years to establish. The first multicellular organisms were little more than clusters of cells, loosely organized, without differentiated tissues, without specialized organs, without anything resembling a body plan. They were colonies more than creatures, aggregations more than animals. And they too persisted in this form for an extraordinarily long time. Then, roughly 635 million years ago, something began to shift. The Earth was emerging from one of the most severe ice ages in its history, a period so cold that glaciers may have extended all the way to the equator, encasing the planet in a shell of ice that some scientists have called Snowball Earth. The causes of this global freezing are still debated. Volcanic activity may have played a role, altering atmospheric chemistry in ways that reduced the greenhouse effect. Continental positions may have disrupted ocean circulation patterns. Whatever the cause, the result was a world locked in ice for millions of years, with life clinging to survival in whatever pockets of liquid water remained, perhaps around volcanic vents on the ocean floor, perhaps in thin layers of meltwater beneath the ice, perhaps in rare open patches of sea near the equator. When the ice finally retreated, the world that emerged was chemically different from the one that had existed before. Oxygen levels in the atmosphere and ocean began to rise, driven by the photosynthetic activity of cyanobacteria that had continued to function even during the frozen period. Nutrients that had been locked in glacial ice were released into the oceans. The chemistry of seawater changed. And in this new chemical environment, life began to do something it had never done before on any visible scale. It began to experiment. The first evidence of this experimentation comes from a period called the Ediacaran, named after the Ediacara Hills in Australia, where some of the earliest fossils were discovered. The Ediacaran lasted from roughly 635 million years ago to about 538 million years ago, and it represents one of the most mysterious chapters in the entire history of life. During the Ediacaran, the first large, complex organisms appeared in the fossil record. And when we say large, we mean large enough to see with the naked eye. Some of them reached several feet in length. These were not microscopic anymore. These were organisms that, if you had been diving in an Ediacaran ocean, you would have noticed. You would have seen them attached to the seafloor, drifting in the water, lying flat on the sediment like strange organic quilts. But here's what makes the Ediacaran so puzzling. We have no idea what most of these organisms were. They do not look like animals. They do not look like plants. They do not look like fungi. They do not look like anything alive today. They had body plans that seemed to follow geometric rules, fractal branching patterns, quilted segments, radial symmetry, but these rules do not match the rules that govern any modern group of organisms. Some of them, like the iconic Dickinsonia, were flat, oval-shaped creatures that lay on the seafloor and apparently absorbed nutrients directly through their skin. Others, like Charnia, were frond-shaped organisms that stood upright in the water, anchored to the bottom by a holdfast, looking for all the world like some kind of feathery plant. But Charnia lived in deep water, far below the reach of sunlight, so it could not have been photosynthetic. What it was doing, how it was feeding, remains unknown. Still others, like Tribrachidium, displayed a threefold symmetry that is almost unheard of in the modern world. Most animals today are either bilaterally symmetrical, like humans, with a left side and a right side, or radially symmetrical, like jellyfish, with a body plan arranged around a central axis. Tribrachidium was neither. It was something else entirely, something that does not fit into any existing category. The Ediacaran organisms present a fundamental challenge to our understanding of life's history. Were they animals? Were they protists, large, complex, single-celled organisms or colonies of cells that mimicked multicellularity? Were they an entirely separate kingdom of life, unrelated to anything alive today, a kind of evolutionary dead end that left no descendants? Scientists have debated these questions for decades, and there is still no consensus. What we do know is that the Ediacaran world was radically different from the world that came after it. It was a world without predators, without hard shells, without jaws, without eyes. A world of soft, strange, quiet creatures that lived and died in the dim depths of ancient oceans, leaving behind only their impressions in fine-grained sediment. And then, quite suddenly in geological terms, they were gone. The transition from the Ediacaran to the Cambrian, the period that begins roughly 538 million years ago, is one of the most dramatic transitions in the entire fossil record. Within a span of perhaps 20 to 25 million years, the fossil record goes from being dominated by soft, enigmatic Ediacaran organisms to being filled with an astonishing diversity of recognizably animal-like creatures. Creatures with eyes, legs, shells, claws, antennae, gills, and internal skeletons. Creatures that could swim, crawl, burrow, and hunt. Creatures that, while still bizarre by modern standards, belong recognizably to the major groups of animals that exist today, or at least to groups closely related to them. This event, this sudden flowering of animal diversity, is called the Cambrian Explosion, and it is one of the most studied, most debated, and most awe-inspiring events in the history of life on Earth. The word explosion is somewhat misleading. It suggests something instantaneous, something violent, something that happened in a flash. In reality, the Cambrian Explosion unfolded over millions of years. 20 million years is a long time by human standards. It encompasses the entire span of human civilization hundreds of times over. But by geological standards, 20 million is brief. The Earth is 4.5 billion years old. Life has existed for at least 3.5 billion of those years. For most of that time, life was slow to change. In a geological instant, everything changed. The question of why the Cambrian explosion happened has occupied scientists for more than a century. Charles Darwin himself was troubled by it. The sudden appearance of so many complex animal forms in the fossil record seemed to contradict his theory of gradual, incremental evolution. If evolution proceeds by slow, steady accumulation of small changes, then where were the intermediate forms? Where were the ancestors? Where was the long, gradual buildup that should have preceded such an explosion of diversity? Darwin's answer was that the fossil record was incomplete. The ancestors existed, he argued, but they were soft-bodied and therefore unlikely to be preserved as fossils. The Cambrian explosion only appeared sudden because we were missing the earlier chapters of the story. And to some extent, Darwin was right. The discovery of Ediacaran fossils in the 20th century showed that complex life did exist before the Cambrian. The discovery of tiny, microscopic fossils from even earlier periods showed that the genetic and cellular machinery for building complex bodies was already in place long before the Cambrian explosion began, but Darwin's explanation is not sufficient by itself. Even accounting for gaps in the fossil record, the Cambrian explosion represents a real, dramatic acceleration in the pace of evolutionary change. Something happened during this period that had never happened before and has never happened since on the same scale. The rate at which new body plans appeared, the speed at which new ecological strategies were invented, the sheer creativity of the biological forms that emerged, all of this was unprecedented. So what caused it? There is no single answer. The Cambrian explosion was almost certainly driven by a combination of factors, each reinforcing the others in a cascading chain of cause and effect. One factor was environmental. Oxygen levels in the atmosphere and ocean were rising during the late Ediacaran and early Cambrian. Made it possible for organisms to grow larger, to be more active, to sustain the metabolic demands of complex tissues like muscles and nervous systems. Without sufficient oxygen, large, active animals simply could not exist. The rise of oxygen opened a door that had been closed for billions of years. Another factor was genetic. By the late Ediacaran, the basic genetic toolkit for building complex animal bodies was already in place. Hox genes, the master regulatory genes that control body plan development in all animals, had already evolved. The molecular machinery for cell-to-cell communication, for tissue differentiation, for programmed cell death, all of these were present. The raw materials for building complex bodies existed. What was needed was the right environmental and ecological context to put them to use, and that context was provided by what may be the most important factor of all, ecological opportunity. Before the Cambrian, the ocean was a relatively empty place. There were no large predators, no fast swimmers, no burrowing organisms disrupting the seafloor. Ecological niches that are filled today were completely vacant. The Ediacaran organisms, whatever they were, occupied only a narrow range of ecological roles. When they disappeared, and most of them did disappear at or near the Ediacaran-Cambrian boundary, they left behind a world full of unoccupied space. And life, given the genetic tools and the environmental conditions to do so, rushed to fill it. This is a pattern that repeats itself throughout the history of life. When ecological space opens up, evolution accelerates. When competition is low and resources are abundant, organisms diversify rapidly, exploring new body plans, new strategies, new ways of making a living. The Cambrian explosion was the first and most spectacular example of this pattern, but it would not be the last. Now, to truly appreciate the Cambrian explosion, you have to look at the creatures themselves. And this is where the story becomes truly extraordinary, because the animals that emerged during this period were unlike anything that exists today. They were experiments in body design, prototypes of biological architecture, and many of them were so strange, so alien, so fundamentally unlike any modern organism that when scientists first discovered their fossils, they could not figure out what they were looking at. The most famous window into this lost world comes from a site in the Canadian Rockies called the Burgess Shale. Discovered in 1909 by the American paleontologist Charles Doolittle Walcott, the Burgess Shale is a thin layer of fine-grained mudstone, roughly 508 million years old, that preserves an astonishing array of soft-bodied organisms in exquisite detail. Most fossils preserve only hard parts, shells, bones, teeth, but the Burgess Shale, through a remarkable combination of rapid burial and anoxic conditions, preserved soft tissues as well. Eyes, guts, legs, gills, antennae. Even the contents of digestive tracts. The Burgess Shale is in effect a snapshot of an entire ecosystem, frozen in stone, complete down to the smallest details. When Walcott first studied the Burgess Shale fossils, he tried to fit them into existing categories. He classified them as early members of known groups: crustaceans, worms, sponges, jellyfish. He was working within the scientific framework of his time, which assumed that all ancient organisms must be ancestors of modern ones, that they must fit somewhere on the tree of life as it was then understood. And so he shoehorned these strange creatures into familiar boxes, and for decades that is where they stayed. It was not until the 1960s and 70s that a new generation of scientists began to re-examine the Burgess Shale fossils with fresh eyes. Led by Harry Whittington of Cambridge University and his graduate students Derek Briggs and Simon Conway Morris, this re-examination revealed something astonishing. Many of the Burgess Shale organisms did not fit into any known group. They were not early crustaceans or early worms or early anything. They were unique. They represented body plans that had never been seen before and have never been seen since. They were evolutionary experiments that had no modern descendants. This realization, popularized by Stephen Jay Gould in his landmark 1989 book, wonderful life, transformed our understanding of evolution. Good argued that the Cambrian explosion was not simply a period of rapid diversification within existing groups, but a period of radical experimentation, during which life explored a much wider range of body plans than exists today. The modern animal kingdom, with its familiar phyla, arthropods, chordates, mollusks, annelids, represents only a fraction of the diversity that once existed. Many entire body plans, entire ways of being an animal, were tried during the Cambrian and subsequently abandoned. This idea was controversial, and it remains controversial today. Some scientists argue that Good overstated the case, that many of the Burgess Shale organisms can in fact be placed within known groups if you look closely enough. Others argue that the concept of body plan is too vague to be useful in this context. But regardless of where individual scientists come down on these debates, the basic observation is undeniable. The Cambrian Ocean was filled with creatures that do not exist today, creatures that were genuinely novel and creatures whose existence challenges our assumptions about how evolution works. Let us look at some of them. Consider Opabinia. This creature, known from only a handful of specimens from the Burgess Shale, is one of the most famous and most baffling animals ever discovered. It was roughly the size of a human thumb, about 7 centimeters long, with a soft, segmented body and a series of overlapping lateral lobes along its sides that it probably used for swimming. So far, so unremarkable, many Cambrian animals had segmented bodies and lateral lobes, but then you look at the head and everything becomes strange. Opabinia had 5 eyes, not 2, not 4, but 5. They were arranged in an unusual pattern on the top of its head, 2 pairs plus 1 in the center, giving it what must have been an extraordinary field of vision. No modern animal has 5 eyes arranged in this way. The number 5 has no particular significance in the symmetry of any known animal group. It is as if Opabinia was following a different set of rules, a different blueprint, one that has no parallel in the living world. And then there is the proboscis. Extending forward from the front of Opabinia's head was a long, like appendage, grasping spines. Not a mouth. The actual mouth was located underneath the head, facing backward. The proboscis appears to have been used to grab food from the seafloor and pass it back to the mouth. It was in essence a built-in feeding tool, a biological hose, and nothing like it exists in any modern animal. When Whittington first presented his reconstruction of Opabinia at a scientific conference in '92, the audience reportedly burst into laughter, not because they thought it was wrong, but because it was so strange that it seemed almost comical. 5 eyes and a backward-facing mouth fed by a flexible nozzle. It sounded like something from a science fiction film, not a real animal, but the fossil evidence was clear. Opabinia was real. It had lived, it had fed, it had reproduced, and it had done so with a body plan that has no equivalent anywhere in the modern world. And Opabinia was far from the strangest creature in the Cambrian Ocean. Consider hallucigenia. When Simon Conway Morris first described this tiny creature in 1977, he named it hallucigenia because it looked like something from a hallucination. The fossil showed a worm-like body with 2 rows of structures along its length, 1 row of long, rigid spines and 1 row of softer, tentacle-like appendages. Conway Morris interpreted the spines as legs, assuming the animal walked on them like stilts, and the tentacles as dorsal feeding structures, waving in the water above the animal's back. This reconstruction was published and widely circulated, and for years it was the accepted image of hallucigenia. But it was wrong, completely wrong. In the 1990s, new specimens were discovered that showed Conway Morris had the animal upside down. The spines were not legs, they were defensive structures projecting upward from the animal's back like a row of thorns. The tentacles were the legs, soft and flexible, used for walking along the seafloor. What Conway Morris had interpreted as the top of the animal was actually the bottom, and vice versa, but the confusion did not end there. For you not determine which end of hallucigenia and which was the tail. The fossil was so unfamiliar, so unlike any living animal, that basic way is up, which way is forward was a genuine scientific. It was not until detailed microscope studies were conducted in the 2000s that the head was finally identified, revealing a small, round mouth surrounded by a ring of teeth with a pair of simple eyes above it. Hallucigenia, we now know, was probably a relative of modern velvet worms, a group of soft-bodied caterpillar-like creatures that live in tropical forests today. But even with this classification, hallucigenia remains deeply strange. Its body plan, with its rigid dorsal spines and soft ventral legs, is unlike that worm. It represents a variation on been abandoned, a road not taken in the evolution of this particular lineage. And this is itself again and again throughout the Cambrian fossil record. Creatures that seem to follow familiar rules up to a point and then veer off in unexpected directions. Creatures that combine features of known groups in ways that make no modern sense. Creatures that are, in the most literal sense of the experimental. Consider Wiwaxia. This was a small, oval-shaped creature, a few centimeters long, that crawled along the Cambrian floor. Its body was covered in rows of overlapped scales, like a suit of chain mail, and from its back projected 2 rows of long, blade-like spines. The scales and spines were similar to the chetae of modern, the tiny bristles you can feel if you were an earthworm, and for this reason, Wiwaxia was identified as an annelid. The body plan does not match that of any known annelid. It had a slug-like foot, similar to that of a mollusk. It had a radula-like feeding structure, again similar to that of a mollusk, and its scales and spines were arranged in a pattern that does not correspond to the segmentation of it. So what was Wiwaxia? Was it a worm? Was it a mollusk? Was it something in between? Or was it something else entirely, a representative of a body features we now think of as belonging to separate groups? This question gets at something fundamental about the Cambrian, the very categories we use to organize life. The classes, the orders, may not have existed yet in any clear form. In the modern world, major animal groups are relatively sharp. An arthropod is a mollusk, a chordate is a chordate. Each group has a distinct set of features, a body plan, and distinguishes it from all others. But in the Cambrian, these blurred, the nations from which the modern phyla diverging, still sorting features, still combinations of traits that were exclusive to one group or another. Wiwaxia, with its ills and mollusk-like, present a time when the line between annelids and mollusks had not yet been drawn. The remnant of a state body plans were more fluid, more modular, more than they are today. The idea that the Cambrian with evolutionary creativity, when the rules governing body plan design were more flexible than they later became, is one of the most important insights to emerge from the study of Cambrian fossils. It suggests that evolution is not always a gradual, linear process. It suggests that there are periods of radical innovation, when the constraints that normally limit biological change are loosened, and life is free to explore a wider range of possibilities. And the Cambrian was the greatest of these periods, the ultimate age of experimentation. But experimentation, by its nature, produces failures as well as successes, and the Cambrian Ocean was full of both. Some of the experiments succeeded spectacularly. The arthropod body plan, segmented body, jointed legs, external skeleton, proved extraordinarily versatile and adaptable. It gave rise to the trilobites, which would dominate the oceans for the next 300 million years. It gave rise to the ancestors of modern insects, spiders, crabs, and lobsters. Today, arthropods are the most diverse group of animals on Earth, with more species than all other animal groups combined. Arthropod experiment was, by any measure, a runaway success. The chordate body plan, internal skeleton, dorsal nerve cord, pharyngeal slits also proved highly successful, though its triumph took longer to become apparent. In the Cambrian, chordates were small, inconspicuous creatures, easily overlooked among the more flamboyant arthropods and anomalocaridids, but they carried within them the basic architecture that would eventually give rise to fish, amphibians, reptiles, birds, and mammals. The chordate experiment was a slow burn, a long-term investment that would not pay its full dividends for hundreds of millions of years. Other experiments were less fortunate. Many of the unique body plans that appeared during the Cambrian left no descendants at all. They flourished for a time, occupied specific ecological niches, and then disappeared, leaving behind only their fossils as evidence that they ever existed. This raises a profound question. Why did some body plans survive and others go extinct? Was it because the survivors were better designed, more efficient, more fit? Or was it because they were lucky, because they happened to be in the right place at the right time when environmental conditions changed? The answer almost certainly is both. Some body plans genuinely were more versatile, more adaptable, more capable of being modified to meet new challenges. The arthropod body plan, for instance, can be tweaked and adjusted in countless ways by changing the number of segments, the shape of the appendages, the thickness of the exoskeleton, without altering its fundamental architecture. This modularity gave arthropods an evolutionary flexibility that more rigid body plans lacked, but luck also played a role. Evolutionary success is not solely determined by the quality of a design. It is also determined by circumstances, by which ecological niches happen to be available, by which competitors happen to be present, by which environmental changes happen. An organism perfectly adapted to one set of conditions can be wiped out overnight if those conditions change. And in the long history of life, conditions have changed many, many times. This interplay between design and luck, between adaptation and contingency, is one of the central themes of evolutionary biology. And it is beautifully illustrated by the Cambrian Explosion, where the full range of biological possibility was on display, and the process of selection, both natural and accidental, was just beginning to sort through it. Now, among all the extraordinary creatures of the Cambrian, none captures the imagination quite like Anomalocaris. This was, by the standards of its time, a monster. At up to a meter in length, it was the largest animal in the Cambrian Ocean, possibly the largest animal that had ever existed up to that point. In a world of centimeter-scale creatures, Anomalocaris was a giant, an apex predator in an ecosystem that was just beginning to understand what predation meant. Its body was streamlined and powerful, built for active swimming. Along its sides, a series of flexible lateral lobes rippled in coordinated waves, propelling it through the water with a grace and speed that no other Cambrian animal could match. Its tail was fan-shaped, providing additional thrust and steering. It was, in essence, the Cambrian equivalent of a shark, a fast, powerful, open-water predator. But the most striking features of Anomalocaris were at the front. Its head was dominated by a pair of large, stalked compound eyes, among the most sophisticated visual organs of the Cambrian, with thousands of individual lenses providing sharp, detailed vision. These eyes were the eyes of a hunter, designed to spot prey at a distance and track it through the water. Below the eyes, a pair of large, segmented grasping appendages extended forward like a pair of articulated arms. These appendages were flexible and powerful, lined with sharp spines, and they were used to seize prey and bring it to the mouth. The mouth itself was a circular structure on the underside of the head, made up of a ring of overlapping plates that could constrict like a camera aperture but probably could not close completely. This is important because it tells us something about how Anomalocaris fed. It did not bite, it did not chew, it grasped and compressed. This method of feeding may seem crude by modern standards. We are accustomed to predators with sharp teeth and powerful jaws, but in the Cambrian it was revolutionary. Before Anomalocaris, there were no large predators in the ocean. There were no organisms capable of actively pursuing and capturing other organisms. The Ediacaran world had been a world without predation, or at least without the kind of active, visually guided predation that Anomalocaris practiced. Anomalocaris changed the rules. It introduced a new dynamic into the ecosystem, a new pressure that forced other organisms to evolve defenses or die, and evolve they did. The appearance of large predators like Anomalocaris is thought to have been one of the major drivers of the Cambrian explosion itself. Once predation became a significant source of mortality, prey organisms were under intense selective pressure to develop defenses, hard shells, protective spines, the ability to burrow into the sediment, the ability to swim fast enough to escape. And each new defense, in turn, put pressure on predators to evolve better weapons, sharper claws, stronger jaws, more acute senses. This escalating arms race between predators and prey is thought to have driven rapid evolutionary change, accelerating the diversification of body plans and ecological strategies. This is sometimes called the arms race hypothesis of the Cambrian explosion, and while it is certainly not the whole story, it captures something real and important about the dynamics of early animal evolution. The Cambrian was not just a period of experimentation for its own sake. It was a period of competition, of conflict, of survival against increasingly sophisticated threats. And the organisms that survived were the ones that found effective ways to fight, flee, or hide. The evidence for this arms race is written in the fossils themselves. Many Cambrian organisms bear the marks of predation, healed bite marks, broken shells, missing limbs. Trilobite fossils from the Cambrian frequently show damage that is consistent with attacks by large predators like Anomalocaris. Some trilobites even evolved the ability to roll up into a ball, protecting their soft undersides behind a shield of hard exoskeleton, a defensive strategy that is still used by their distant relatives, the pill bugs, today. Other organisms evolved chemical defenses, toxic or unpalatable compounds that made them unattractive to predators. Others evolved camouflage, blending in with their surroundings to avoid detection. Others evolved speed, developing more efficient swimming or crawling mechanisms that allowed them to outrun their pursuers. And others evolved the most important defense of all, the ability to see. The evolution of vision is one of the most fascinating and consequential developments in the history of life, and it began in the Cambrian. Before the Cambrian, most organisms had at best simple light-sensitive patches, groups of photoreceptor cells that could detect the presence or absence of light and perhaps the direction it was coming from, but could not form images. These light-sensitive patches were useful for basic orientation, distinguishing up from down, light from dark, day from night, but they did not allow an organism to see the world in any detailed way. During the Cambrian, some lineages began to develop more sophisticated visual organs. Photoreceptor cells became concentrated and organized. Lenses evolved, focusing light onto the photoreceptor surface and producing a crude but usable image. Nervous systems developed the capacity to process visual information, to extract meaning from the patterns of light and dark falling on the eye. The result was a revolution in animal behavior. For the first time in the history of life, organisms could see each other. Predators could spot prey at a distance. Prey could detect approaching predators and take evasive action. Potential mates could find each other across the vastness of the ocean. The world went from being a place of blind, random encounters to a place of directed, purposeful interaction. This transformation from a world without vision to a world with vision has been called the light switch hypothesis by the British zoologist Andrew Parker. Parker argues that the evolution of image-forming eyes was the primary trigger for the Cambrian Explosion, the event that set the entire cascade of diversification in motion. Once some organisms could see, the rules of the game changed for everyone. Predators with eyes had a massive advantage over those without. Prey that could see approaching predators had a massive advantage over those that could not. The result was intense selective pressure on all organisms to evolve eyes as quickly as possible, and this pressure, Parker argues, drove the rapid diversification of body plans that characterizes the Cambrian Explosion. Parker's hypothesis is elegant and compelling, though it is probably too simple to be the whole story. The Cambrian Explosion was driven by many factors, not just one. But the evolution of vision was undeniably important, and its effects are clearly visible in the fossil record. The Cambrian is filled with creatures that had eyes, some of them remarkably sophisticated eyes, with lenses made of crystalline calcite that would have produced sharp, clear images. The trilobites in particular had compound eyes of astonishing complexity, with hundreds or even thousands of individual lenses, each precisely oriented to capture light from a specific direction. These trilobite eyes are among the oldest known visual organs in the fossil record, and they tell us something remarkable about the pace of evolution during the Cambrian. The eye is a complex organ, requiring the coordinated development of lenses, photoreceptors, pigment cells, and neural connections. The fact that such organs appeared so early in the history of animal life, within just a few tens of millions of years of the first appearance of animals in the fossil record, suggests that the pace of evolutionary innovation during the Cambrian was extraordinarily rapid. And here is something else remarkable about Cambrian eyes. They came in a bewildering variety of designs. Trilobites had compound eyes with multiple lenses. Anomalocaris also had compound eyes, but of a different design, larger, with more lenses and mounted on stalks. Opabinia had 5 simple eyes, arranged in a pattern that has no parallel in the modern world. Some organisms had eyes on the ends of long stalks, others had eyes recessed into the body. Still others had light-sensitive patches distributed along the length of their bodies, giving them something like all-around vision without having dedicated eyes at all. This diversity of eye designs is another example of the experimental nature of the Cambrian. Life was not converging on a single optimal solution to the problem of vision. It was exploring multiple solutions simultaneously, each tailored to the specific needs and ecology of the organism that bore it. Some of these solutions would prove more successful than others in the long run. Compound eyes, for instance, would go on to become the dominant visual system in arthropods, and they remain the most common type of eye in the animal kingdom today. Simple camera-type eyes, like those of vertebrates and cephalopods, would take a different evolutionary path but ultimately achieve even greater acuity. Other designs, the 5-eyed arrangement of Opabinia, for instance, would disappear entirely, leaving no descendants. But in the Cambrian, all of these designs were on the table. All of them were being tested, all of them were part of the grand experiment. Let us turn now to the seafloor itself, because the Cambrian transformation was not just about the animals that swam and crawled above it. The seafloor itself was changing, and this change had profound consequences for the entire ecosystem. Before the Cambrian, the seafloor was covered with what scientists call a microbial mat, a dense, cohesive layer of microorganisms, primarily cyanobacteria and other photosynthetic or chemosynthetic bacteria that formed a kind of living carpet over the sediment. This microbial mat was tough and resilient, binding the sediment together and creating a firm, stable surface. Organisms that lived on the seafloor lived on top of this mat or just barely within it. The interior of the sediment, the layers below the surface, was largely anoxic, devoid of oxygen, and uninhabitable for most organisms. During the Cambrian, this changed. The evolution of burrowing organisms, animals that could dig into the sediment, tunneling through it, mixing it, aerating it, destroyed the microbial mat and transformed the seafloor from a firm, two-dimensional surface into a soft, three-dimensional habitat. This event, sometimes called the Cambrian substrate revolution or the agronomic revolution, fundamentally altered the ecology of the ocean floor. For organisms that had been adapted to life on the firm surface of the microbial mat, this was a disaster. Their habitat was literally pulled out from under them. Many of the Ediacaran organisms, which had lived flat on the mat's surface, may have been casualties of this transformation. They were adapted to a world that no longer existed. But for other organisms, the destruction of the microbial mat created new opportunities. The soft, churned-up sediment was full of organic matter, the remains of the microbial mat itself, and could be mined for food. The three-dimensional structure of the burrowed sediment created new habitats, burrows, tunnels, crevices that could be used for shelter. And the increased oxygen penetration into the sediment, driven by the mixing activity of burrowing organisms, made it possible for aerobic organisms to live at depths that had previously been uninhabitable. The burrowing revolution was, in its own quiet way, as transformative as the evolution of predation or the evolution of vision. It restructured the physical environment of the ocean floor, creating new ecological niches and destroying old ones. It was another example of how the Cambrian was not just a period of biological innovation, but a period of ecological transformation, when the entire structure of marine ecosystems was being remade from the ground up. Now, let us consider another group of organisms that emerged during this period and would go on to extraordinary success, the trilobites. Trilobites are among the most iconic fossils in the world. Their distinctive three-lobed body plan, a central axial lobe flanked by two lateral lobes, is instantly recognizable, and their fossils are found in rocks spanning a period of nearly 300 million years, from the early Cambrian to the late Permian. No other group of marine arthropods has achieved such longevity or such diversity. At their peak, trilobites occupied virtually every ecological niche available to a marine arthropod, from shallow coastal waters to the deep ocean floor, from the tropics to the polar regions. The earliest trilobites appeared in the fossil record roughly 521 million years ago, during the early Cambrian. They were already complex organisms, with segmented bodies, jointed legs, and compound eyes. The fact that they appeared so early and in such a fully developed form suggests that their evolutionary origins lie even further back, in the Ediacaran or perhaps the earliest Cambrian, among soft-bodied ancestors that left no fossil record. What made trilobites so successful? Several factors stand out. First, their exoskeleton. Trilobites were among the first organisms to evolve a hard, mineralized exoskeleton, a tough outer shell made of calcite, a form of calcium carbonate. This exoskeleton served multiple functions. It provided protection against predators, it gave structural support to the body, and it served as an anchor for muscles, allowing trilobites to move their legs and other appendages with precision and force. The evolution of a mineralized exoskeleton was one of the defining innovations of the Cambrian, and trilobites were among its earliest and most successful adopters. Second, their eyes. As mentioned earlier, trilobite compound eyes were remarkable organs, with hundreds or thousands of individual lenses made of crystalline calcite. These lenses were uniquely shaped to correct for optical aberrations, producing sharp images across a wide field of view. Some trilobites had eyes that wrapped around the sides of the head, giving them nearly 360-degree vision. Others had elevated eyes mounted on stalks that allowed them to scan the surrounding water while the rest of the body remained buried in the sediment. Trilobite eyes were quite literally among the most advanced visual organs in the Cambrian Ocean. Third, their versatility. The basic trilobite body plan, three-lobed, segmented with multiple pairs of legs, could be modified in an almost infinite number of ways. Some trilobites were small and streamlined, adapted for fast swimming. Others were large and flat, adapted for life on the seafloor. Some had elaborate spines and ornaments, possibly for defense or display. Others had smooth, featureless exoskeletons optimized for burrowing. Some were filter feeders, straining microscopic food particles from the water. Others were scavengers, feeding on dead organic matter on the seafloor. Still others were predators, actively hunting smaller organisms. This versatility allowed trilobites to diversify into an extraordinary range of forms and to occupy an extraordinary range of ecological niches. Over the course of their 300-million-year reign, they produced thousands of species, ranging in size from a few millimeters to over 70 centimeters. They were, for much of the Paleozoic era, the dominant arthropods of the ocean. But even trilobites, for all their success, were eventually surpassed. Their story, like the story of so many Cambrian innovators, is ultimately a story of rise and decline, of early dominance followed by gradual replacement by newer, more efficient designs. We will return to this theme later. For now, let us consider another aspect of the Cambrian that is often overlooked, the evolution of ecology itself. Today, we take for granted the basic structure of marine ecosystems. There are producers, photosynthetic organisms like phytoplankton and seaweeds, that capture energy from sunlight and convert it into organic matter. There are primary consumers, herbivores and filter feeders that eat the producers. There are secondary consumers, predators that eat the primary consumers. And there are decomposers, bacteria and fungi that break down dead organic matter and recycle its nutrients back into the system. This structure, the food web, is so fundamental to modern ecology that it seems almost inevitable, almost natural, as if it could not be otherwise. But in the early Cambrian, this structure was just being assembled. The food web did not spring into existence fully formed. It was built up gradually, piece by piece, as new organisms evolved new ecological roles and new relationships with one another. Before the Cambrian, the ocean food web was extremely simple. Primary producers, cyanobacteria and other photosynthetic microorganisms, captured energy from sunlight. Some of this energy was consumed by heterotrophic microorganisms, bacteria and protists that fed on the photosynthesizers, and that was essentially it. There were no large herbivores, no large predators, no complex chains of consumption linking one organism to another through multiple trophic levels. The Cambrian changed all of this. The evolution of large, actively feeding animals created new trophic levels, new links in the food chain. Filter feeders strained phytoplankton and organic particles from the water, channeling energy from the microscopic world into the macroscopic world. Grazers scraped algae and microbial mats from the seafloor, another pathway for energy transfer. Predators fed on the grazers and filter feeders, adding yet another trophic level. And scavengers and decomposers broke down the remains of all of these organisms, returning nutrients to the water and sediment. The result was a food web of unprecedented complexity, with multiple pathways for energy flow, multiple feedback loops, and multiple opportunities for specialization. This complexity, in turn, created new ecological niches, new ways of making a living that could be exploited by new organisms. The food web became self-reinforcing. The more complex it became, the more opportunities it created for further complexity. This ecological expansion was as much a part of the Cambrian explosion as the evolution of new body plans. In fact, the two are inseparable. New body plans evolved because new ecological niches existed, and new ecological niches existed because new body plans created new interactions, new relationships, new dynamics within the ecosystem. The Cambrian explosion was not just an explosion of morphological diversity. It was an explosion of ecological diversity, an explosion of relationships, an explosion of the ways in which organisms could interact with one another and with their environment. Now let us talk about something that is crucial to understanding the Cambrian and yet is rarely discussed in popular accounts: the role of failure. The Cambrian was an age of experimentation, and experiments, by definition, do not always succeed. For every body plan that proved viable in the long term, there were many more that did not. For every lineage that survived and diversified, there were many more that appeared briefly, occupied a narrow niche, and then vanished without a trace. These vanished lineages are not failures in any meaningful sense. They were not inferior or poorly designed. Many of them were beautifully adapted to their specific environments and ecological roles. They were, by any reasonable measure, successful organisms, successful in the sense that they survived, reproduced, and maintained viable populations for millions of years. But the conditions that made them successful did not last. Environments changed, competitors appeared, predators evolved new strategies. And the organisms that had been perfectly adapted to one set of conditions found themselves poorly adapted to the new ones. Their specializations, which had once been advantages, became liabilities. Their narrow ecological niches, which had once provided shelter, became traps. This is one of the great paradoxes of evolution. Specialization, which is the key to short-term success, can be the road to long-term extinction. An organism that is perfectly adapted to a specific environment is vulnerable to any change in that environment. An organism that is more generalized, less perfectly adapted but more flexible, may be less successful in the short term but more resilient in the long term. The history of life is full of examples of this pattern: highly specialized organisms that dominated their environments for millions of years, only to be swept aside when conditions changed, replaced by more generalized forms that could adjust and adapt. The Cambrian was the first great demonstration of this pattern. Many of the exotic body plans that appeared during the Cambrian Explosion were highly specialized, adapted to specific environments, specific food sources, specific ecological interactions. When those environments changed, when those food sources disappeared, when those ecological interactions were disrupted, the specialized organisms could not adapt. They went extinct, leaving behind only their fossils as evidence that they had ever existed. And this is what makes the Cambrian fossil record so poignant. It is a record not just of success but of loss. A record of possibilities that were explored and then abandoned. A record of roads not taken, of futures that never materialized. When we look at a fossil of Apobinia or Hallucigenia or Anomalocaris, we are looking at an organism that was once as real, as alive, as vital as any organism alive today. It had a history, a lineage, a place in the world. And then it was gone, not because it was a failure, but because the world changed and it could not change with it. This is the fundamental truth of evolution, and it applies as much to the present as to the past. Survival is not guaranteed. Success is not permanent. The organisms of the world today are no more immune to extinction than the organisms that dominated the Cambrian Ocean 500 million years ago. The only constant in the history of life is change. And change is the one thing that no organism, no matter how well adapted, can fully prepare for. Let us now turn our attention to a creature that, in the Cambrian, was small and insignificant, but would eventually give rise to the most dominant group of vertebrates on Earth, the early chordates. Chordates, the phylum that includes all vertebrates from fish to humans, are defined by a set of shared characteristics: a dorsal nerve cord, a notochord, a flexible rod that provides structural support, pharyngeal slits, openings in the throat region, and a post-anal tail. In the modern world, chordates include some of the largest, most complex, and most ecologically dominant animals on the planet, but in the Cambrian they were nearly invisible. The earliest known chordate from the fossil record is a tiny, lancelet-like creature called Pichia, known from the Burgess Shale. Pichia was only a few centimeters long, with a thin, ribbon-like body and no hard parts at all, no bones, no shell, no armor. It probably swam through the water by undulating its body from side to side, propelled by the contraction of segmental muscle blocks arranged along its notochord. In the Cambrian Ocean, Pichia would have been a nobody. Surrounded by armored trilobites, predatory anomalocaridids, and a dizzying array of spiny, shelled, and tentacled creatures, Pichia was small, soft, and defenseless. If you had been a Cambrian marine biologist, you would not have given it a second glance. You certainly would not have predicted that its descendants would one day walk on land, fly through the air, and build civilizations. But Pichia carried within it the basic architecture of the chordate body plan: the notochord, the dorsal nerve cord, the segmental muscle blocks, and this architecture, humble as it was, contained the seeds of extraordinary future diversity. The notochord would eventually be replaced by a vertebral column, a spine providing stronger, more rigid structural support. The dorsal nerve cord would expand and elaborate into a brain and spinal cord of unprecedented complexity. The pharyngeal slits would be modified into gills, jaws, and a variety of other structures. None of this was apparent in the Cambrian. None of it was inevitable. The success of the chordate lineage was not written in its DNA. It was contingent on a long series of environmental changes, ecological interactions, and evolutionary innovations that could easily have gone differently. If conditions had been slightly different, if the Cambrian Ocean had been a little warmer, a little colder, a little more or less oxygenated, the chordate lineage might have gone extinct in its infancy, and the entire subsequent history of vertebrate life would never have happened. This is the power and the terror of contingency. The future is not predetermined. It is shaped by events that are, in many cases, unpredictable and unrepeatable. The organisms that dominate the world today are not here because they were destined to be here. They are here because a particular sequence of events, stretching back hundreds of millions of years, happened to unfold in a particular way. Change any one of those events, and the result might be a world unrecognizably different from our own. There is another early chordate from the Cambrian that deserves mention: Haequitches from the Chengjiang fossil beds in China. Hayquechthys is older than Pichia. It dates to approximately 518 million years ago, and it is arguably more fish-like. It had a distinct head with paired eyes, a series of structures that may have been primitive gill pouches, and what appears to be a rudimentary vertebral column, not true bone, but a series of cartilaginous elements arranged along the notochord, providing additional structural support. If Hayquechthys is indeed a vertebrate, and not all scientists agree on this classification, then it is one of the oldest known vertebrates in the fossil record. It tells us that the basic vertebrate body plan was already taking shape in the early Cambrian, contemporaneous with the great diversification of arthropods and other invertebrate groups. The chordates were not latecomers to the Cambrian party. They were there from the beginning, small and inconspicuous, but present. Other Cambrian chordates and chordate relatives include Miloconmingia, another small fish-like creature from Chengjiang, and Cathameris, a possible lancelet relative. Together, these fossils paint a picture of a chordate lineage that was already diversifying in the early Cambrian, exploring different variations on the basic chordate body plan, even as the arthropods and other groups were conducting their own, far more conspicuous experiments. The contrast between the flashy, dramatic evolution of the arthropods and the quiet, understated evolution of the early chordates is striking, and it contains an important lesson about the nature of evolutionary success. Success is not always dramatic, it is not always visible. Sometimes the most important innovations are the ones that go unnoticed at the time, the ones that only reveal their significance millions of years later. The chordate body plan, with its flexible notochord and expandable nerve cord, was one such innovation. It was modest in the Cambrian, but it contained the potential for a kind of complexity and adaptability that no other body plan could match. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. In the Cambrian, chordates were minor players, and the ocean belonged to the arthropods and their kin. Let us return to the broader picture and consider another crucial aspect of the Cambrian world, the geography. The continents of the Cambrian were not arranged as they are today. 500 million years ago, the Earth's landmasses were grouped primarily in the southern hemisphere, with the largest continent, Gondwana, straddling the South Pole. Gondwana was a supercontinent, a vast landmass composed of what would eventually become Africa, South America, Antarctica, Australia, India, and parts of southern Europe and the Middle East. But in the Cambrian, these future continents were fused together into a single enormous block. Other, smaller continents were scattered across the equatorial and northern regions. Laurentia, the core of what would become North America, was positioned near the equator, rotated roughly 90 degrees from its current orientation. Baltica, the core of northern Europe, was separate from Laurentia, located in the southern hemisphere. Siberia occupied a position in the northern hemisphere, also separate from the other landmasses. Between and around these continents, vast shallow seas covered much of the Earth's surface. These shallow seas, called epicontinental or eparic seas, were warm, well-lit, and nutrient-rich, and they provided ideal habitat for marine life. Much of the Cambrian fossil record comes from sediments deposited in these shallow seas, because the conditions there were particularly favorable for the preservation of fossils. The arrangement of the continents had profound effects on ocean circulation, climate, and the distribution of marine life. Warm equatorial currents flowed through the gaps between the continents, distributing heat around the globe. The presence of large landmasses near the poles affected the formation of glaciers and ice caps, which in turn influenced sea levels and the extent of the shallow continental shelves. The biogeography of the Cambrian was complex. Different regions of the ocean supported different communities of organisms, reflecting local environmental conditions, evolutionary history, and the barriers to dispersal created by ocean currents and continental positions. Trilobite faunas from Laurentia were different from those from Gondwana, and both were different from those from Siberia. This biogeographic differentiation tells us that even in the Cambrian, the ocean was not a uniform environment. It was a patchwork of distinct habitats, each with its own characteristic community of organisms. This biogeographic complexity added yet another dimension to the Cambrian explosion. Not only were new body plans evolving, but they were evolving independently in different parts of the world, under different environmental conditions, in response to different ecological pressures. The Cambrian explosion was not a single event that happened in one place and spread outward. It was a global phenomenon, happening simultaneously, though with regional variations, across the entire ocean. The fossil sites that provide our best windows into the Cambrian world reflect this geographic diversity. The Burgess Shale, in what is now the Canadian Rockies, preserves a community of organisms that lived in relatively deep water on the margin of Laurentia. The Chengjiang fossil beds, in what is now Yunnan province in China, preserve a slightly older community from the shallow seas of South China. The Emu Bay Shale, in what is now South Australia, preserves yet another community from the margin of Gondwana. Each of these sites provides a different perspective on the Cambrian world, and together they give us a remarkably detailed, if still incomplete, picture of life in the early ocean. There is another dimension of the Cambrian world that we have not yet discussed, and it is in many ways the most alien aspect of all, the chemistry of the ocean itself. The Cambrian Ocean was chemically different from the modern ocean in several important ways. Oxygen levels, while higher than they had been during the Precambrian, were still lower than today, perhaps only half to two-thirds of modern levels in the atmosphere, and significantly lower in many parts of the deep ocean. This meant that large areas of the ocean floor were anoxic or very low in oxygen, creating hostile environments where most animal life could not survive. The chemistry of seawater was also different. Calcium concentrations were higher, which may have facilitated the evolution of mineralized skeletons and shells, the hard parts that suddenly appear in such profusion in the early Cambrian fossil record. Magnesium concentrations were different. The ratio of calcium to magnesium in the seawater influenced which minerals organisms could use to build their skeletons, and this ratio has fluctuated over geological time. The temperature of the ocean was probably warmer than today, though this varied by region and depth. The early Cambrian is thought to have been a relatively warm period, with no permanent polar ice caps and warm temperatures extending to relatively high latitudes. This warmth would have influenced the distribution of organisms, the rate of metabolic processes, and the overall productivity of the ocean. These chemical and physical differences remind us that the Cambrian Ocean was not simply a younger version of the modern ocean populated by different organisms. It was a fundamentally different environment, different in its chemistry, its temperature, its oxygen levels, its geography, and its ecology. The organisms that lived in it were adapted to this specific environment, and many of their features, their body sizes, their metabolic rates, their shell compositions, their ecological strategies, reflect the particular conditions of the Cambrian world. This is an important point because it cautions us against interpreting Cambrian organisms solely in terms of modern analogies. When we see a Cambrian creature with compound eyes, we instinctively compare it to modern arthropods with compound eyes, insects, crustaceans, and assume that it perceived the world in a similar way. When we see a Cambrian predator with grasping appendages, we compare it to modern predators with claws or jaws and assume that it hunted in a similar fashion. But these comparisons can be misleading. The Cambrian world was different enough from the modern world that the same structures may have served different functions, and the same ecological roles may have been played in different ways. This is one of the great challenges of paleontology, reconstructing the behavior and ecology of organisms that lived in environments we have never experienced, using body parts that have no modern equivalent in ecosystems that no longer exist. It requires a combination of rigorous scientific analysis and creative imagination, and even the best reconstructions are, at some level, educated guesses. But they are educated guesses supported by an increasingly rich body of evidence. New fossil discoveries, new analytical techniques, new computational methods, all of these are expanding our understanding of the Cambrian world at an accelerating pace. Every year, new species are described, new ecological relationships are inferred, new insights are gained into the physical and chemical environment of the early ocean. The picture that is emerging is far more detailed, far more nuanced, and far more surprising than anything scientists of previous generations could have imagined. Let us now consider a question that has puzzled scientists for decades. Why did the Cambrian explosion happen when it did? Why not earlier? Why not later? We have already discussed some of the factors that contributed to the Cambrian explosion. Rising oxygen levels, the evolution of the genetic toolkit for building complex bodies, the opening of ecological space after the disappearance of the Ediacaran biota. But the timing question is deeper than any single factor. It asks why all of these factors converged at roughly the same time, creating the conditions for an explosion of diversity that had no precedent and has had no equal. One possibility is that it was simply a coincidence, that the various factors happened to come together at this particular moment in Earth history by chance, without any deeper causal connection. This is possible, but it seems unlikely. The factors are too interrelated, too interconnected to be entirely independent. Rising oxygen levels, for instance, are connected to the evolution of photosynthetic organisms and to changes in ocean chemistry. The opening of ecological space is connected to the disappearance of the Ediacaran biota, which itself is connected to environmental changes. These factors are not independent variables. They are parts of a single, interconnected system, and their convergence at the Ediacaran-Cambrian boundary suggests some underlying dynamic that brought them together. Another possibility is that there was a threshold effect, that several of the key factors had been gradually approaching critical levels for millions or billions of years, and that they all crossed their respective thresholds at roughly the same time, triggering a cascade of rapid change. This is the idea that evolution was, in some sense, primed for an explosion, waiting for the last piece of the puzzle to fall into place. And when it did, the result was not gradual change, but a sudden, dramatic transformation. There is evidence to support this idea. Oxygen levels, for instance, appear to have crossed a critical threshold in the late Ediacaran that made large, active animal life physiologically possible for the first time. Below this threshold, the metabolic demands of large, complex bodies could not be met. Above it, they could. Similarly, the genetic toolkit for building complex body plans appears to have reached a critical level of sophistication in the late Ediacaran, with the evolution of key regulatory genes that could be redeployed in new ways to produce new structures. When these thresholds were crossed, when oxygen levels were high enough, when the genetic toolkit was sophisticated enough, when ecological space was open enough, the result was an explosion of evolutionary innovation. Not because any single factor caused it, but because the combination of all the factors together created conditions that had never existed before and that released evolutionary potential that had been building up for billions of years. This is a satisfying explanation, and it may be close to the truth, but it is important to acknowledge that we do not know for certain. The Cambrian explosion remains, in many ways, a mystery. We understand its outlines. We understand many of the factors that contributed to it, but we do not fully understand why it happened when it did, why it happened the way it did, or why nothing comparable has happened since. These are questions that continue to drive research and debate in paleontology and evolutionary biology, and they may not be fully answered for many years to come. What we can say with confidence is that the Cambrian explosion was a real event, not an artifact of the fossil record, not an illusion created by incomplete preservation, but a genuine, dramatic acceleration in the pace of evolutionary change. It happened. It transformed the ocean. It laid the foundations for all subsequent animal life. And it produced a world of creatures so strange, so diverse, and so profoundly different from anything alive today that studying them is like visiting another planet. Now let us return to the ocean itself and consider what happened after the initial burst of the Cambrian explosion, because the explosion, dramatic as it was only the beginning. The creatures that appeared during the Cambrian did not remain static. They continued to evolve, to diversify, to interact with one another and with their environment. And as they did so, the ocean began to change in ways that would have profound consequences for the future of life. One of the most important changes was the intensification of predation. We have already discussed the evolution of Anomalocaris and other early predators. But in the decades and centuries following the initial explosion, predation became increasingly sophisticated, increasingly varied, and increasingly central to the dynamics of marine ecosystems. New predatory strategies evolved. Some predators became ambush specialists, lying in wait on the seafloor and striking when prey came within range. Others became pursuit predators, actively chasing their prey through the water column. Still others became trap builders, constructing burrows or other structures that funneled prey into their grasp. And as predatory strategies diversified, so did defensive strategies. The arms race between predators and prey, which had begun with the evolution of the first large predators in the early Cambrian, escalated rapidly during the Middle and Late Cambrian. Prey organisms evolved thicker shells, sharper spines, faster swimming speeds, more effective camouflage, and more sophisticated sensory systems. Predators in turn evolved more powerful grasping appendages, more acute vision, more efficient locomotion, and more effective hunting strategies. This escalating arms race drove rapid evolutionary change in both predators and prey, producing an ever-increasing diversity of forms and strategies. It also drove the evolution of behavioral complexity. Organisms that could learn from experience, that could modify their behavior in response to changing conditions, that could anticipate and react to the actions of other organisms, had a significant advantage in the arms race. The evolution of more complex nervous systems, larger brains, more sophisticated sensory processing, more flexible behavioral repertoires was, at least in part, a consequence of the intensifying pressure of predation and competition. This is a theme that runs throughout the entire history of animal life, the relentless escalation of the predator-prey arms race, driving ever greater complexity in both body and behavior. It began in the Cambrian, and it has continued without interruption to the present day. Every time a predator evolves a new weapon, prey organisms evolve new defenses. Every time prey organisms evolve a new defense, predators evolve new strategies to overcome it. The result is a never-ending cycle of innovation and counter-innovation, driving the evolution of increasingly sophisticated organisms. But arms races have limits. They cannot escalate indefinitely. At some point, the costs of further escalation outweigh the benefits. Building a thicker shell requires more energy, more calcium, more time. Swimming faster requires more muscle, more oxygen, more food. There are trade-offs inherent in every adaptation, and these trade-offs impose constraints on how far an arms race can go. These constraints are one of the forces that eventually channel the wild diversity of the Cambrian into narrower, more standardized patterns. As arms races escalate and constraints tighten, the range of viable body plans narrows. Designs that are too specialized, too costly, too inflexible are weeded out. Designs that are efficient, versatile, and cost-effective are favored. The result, over time, is a reduction in the total number of fundamentally different body plans and an increase in the optimization and refinement of the surviving ones. This process, the narrowing of body plan diversity combined with the increasing refinement of surviving designs, is one of the most important trends in the history of life after the Cambrian. The Cambrian was the period of maximum experimentation, when the widest range of body plans was on display. Everything that came after was, in a sense, a process of selection and refinement, a gradual winnowing of the possibilities that the Cambrian had generated. But this process did not happen overnight. It unfolded over hundreds of millions of years, through a complex interplay of environmental change, ecological competition, evolutionary innovation, and sheer chance. And along the way there were many twists and turns, many surprises, many events that no one could have predicted. Let us talk about one more aspect of the Cambrian world before we bring this first part of our story to a close: the role of chance. We have discussed many factors that shape the Cambrian explosion: oxygen levels, genetic toolkits, ecological opportunities, predator-prey arms races. All of these are deterministic factors in the sense that they follow from the laws of physics, chemistry, and biology. Given the right conditions, these factors will produce predictable results. Higher oxygen levels will support larger bodies. Better eyes will produce more effective hunters. More intense predation will drive the evolution of better defenses. But there is another factor that played an equally important role in shaping the Cambrian world, and it is the one that is hardest to account for: chance. Evolutionary history is full of chance events: asteroid impacts, volcanic eruptions, sudden changes in ocean chemistry, random mutations that happen to produce novel and useful structures. These events are unpredictable. They follow no pattern. They are not directed toward any goal, and yet they can have profound and lasting effects on the course of evolution. In the Cambrian, chance events played a crucial role in determining which lineages survived and which went extinct. A sudden shift in ocean chemistry might wipe out one group of organisms while leaving another unscathed, simply because of where they happened to be living at the time. A random mutation might produce a novel structure, a new kind of eye, a new kind of shell, a new kind of appendage that happened to be useful in the current environment, giving its bearer a crucial advantage over its competitors. The role of chance in evolution is not a minor footnote, it is a central feature of the process. Evolution is not a march of progress, moving inevitably toward greater complexity and sophistication. It is a contingent, unpredictable, path-dependent process, shaped as much by accidents as by adaptations. The organisms that survive are not always the best designed or the most efficient. Sometimes they are simply the luckiest. This does not mean that adaptation is unimportant. It is vitally important. Natural selection is a powerful force, and it does tend to produce organisms that are well adapted to their environments. But adaptation operates within a framework shaped by chance, by the particular accidents of history that determine which organisms are present in a given environment, which genetic variations are available for selection to act on, and which environmental changes happen to occur. The Cambrian explosion is the ultimate demonstration of this interplay between adaptation and chance. The organisms that emerged during this period were in many cases beautifully adapted to their specific environments and ecological roles. but which organisms emerged, which body plans were explored, which lineages survived and which went extinct. All of these were shaped, to a significant degree, by chance events that could easily have gone differently. This is why the Cambrian is such a fascinating and humbling period in the history of life. It reminds us that the world we live in, with its familiar animals, its familiar ecosystems, its familiar rules, is not the only world that was possible. It is one outcome among many. A different roll of the dice, a different sequence of chance events, and the world might look entirely different. The organisms that dominate the planet today might never have existed. Other organisms, ones we have never seen and can barely imagine, might have taken their place. This is the deepest lesson of the Cambrian explosion. The present is contingent. It is the product of a particular history, a particular sequence of events stretching back 500 million years and more. Change any one of those events and the result might be a world unrecognizably different from our own. And yet, here we are, the products of that long, contingent, unpredictable history. The descendants, however distant, however transformed, of the small, soft, inconspicuous chordates that swam through the Cambrian Ocean 500 million years ago. We are the inheritors of the Cambrian legacy, the latest chapter in a story that began with the first experiments in the first ocean. It is a story that is far from over. As the Cambrian drew toward its middle and later stages, the frantic pace of the initial explosion began to moderate. Not because evolution slowed down, it did not, but because the easy opportunities had been seized. The empty niches of the post-Ediacaran ocean were filling up. Competition was intensifying. The wild experimentation of the early Cambrian was giving way to something more focused, more directed, more constrained. This transition is sometimes described as a shift from exploration to exploitation. In the early Cambrian, life was exploring the space of possible body plans, trying out new designs with abandon, casting about for strategies that worked. By the Middle Cambrian, the exploration phase was winding down and the exploitation phase was beginning. The basic body plans had been established. The major ecological roles had been filled. From this point on, evolution would focus less on inventing new body plans and more on refining, optimizing, and diversifying within existing ones. This does not mean that innovation ceased, far from it. The history of life after the Cambrian is full of remarkable innovations: the evolution of jaws, the evolution of lungs, the evolution of flight, the evolution of endothermy. But these innovations were built on the foundations laid during the Cambrian. They were modifications and elaborations of existing body plans, not entirely new inventions from scratch. The arthropod body plan was tweaked and adjusted to produce insects, spiders, crabs, and barnacles. The chordate body plan was elaborated to produce fish, amphibians, reptiles, birds, and mammals, but the basic architectures, the fundamental patterns of organization, remain the same. This is one of the most remarkable aspects of the Cambrian explosion, its lasting impact. The body plans that emerged during the Cambrian have persisted, with modifications, for over 500 million years. They have survived ice ages, mass extinctions, continental rearrangements, and dramatic changes in ocean chemistry and atmospheric composition. They are, in a sense, the permanent legacy of the Cambrian explosion, the enduring framework within which all subsequent animal evolution has taken place. And this raises a final, tantalizing question: could it happen again? Could another explosion of body plan diversity occur, producing new phyla, new fundamental patterns of animal organization, as different from existing ones as arthropods are from chordates? Most scientists think the answer is no, or at least not under current conditions. The ecological landscape is too crowded, the arms race is too advanced, the constraints too tight. There is no empty ocean waiting to be filled. Every ecological niche is occupied, every resource is contested, every strategy has been tried and tested by hundreds of millions of years of competition. A new body plan, even if it appeared, would face immediate and intense competition from established lineages that have had 500 million years to optimize their designs. But this answer comes with a caveat. It assumes that current conditions will persist. And we know from the history of the Earth itself that conditions do not persist. They change. Sometimes gradually, sometimes catastrophically. And when they change dramatically enough, when a mass extinction clears the ecological landscape, removing established lineages and opening up vast swathes of empty niche space, then the constraints loosen and the pace of evolutionary innovation accelerates. It has happened before. After each of the major mass extinctions in Earth's history, there has been a burst of evolutionary diversification, as surviving lineages radiated into the newly vacated ecological space. These post-extinction radiations never quite matched the Cambrian explosion in scope. They produced new species and families and orders, but not new phyla. but they demonstrate that the potential for rapid evolutionary change is always present, waiting to be released by the right combination of circumstances. The Cambrian explosion was the first and greatest of these radiations, the moment when the full potential of animal life was unleashed for the first time. Everything that followed, the rise of fish, the colonization of land, the age of dinosaurs, the ascent of mammals, was, in a sense, an elaboration on themes first stated in the Cambrian Ocean. We have covered an enormous amount of ground in this first part of our story. We have traveled from the age of microbial mats and single-celled organisms to the astonishing diversity of the Cambrian explosion. We have met creatures with 5 eyes and backward-facing mouths, creatures that were reconstructed upside down by their discoverers, creatures that combined features of groups now kept strictly separate. We have discussed the evolution of predation, the evolution of vision, the transformation of the seafloor, and the role of chance in shaping the history of life, but we have only reached the middle of the story. The Cambrian was the beginning, not the end. After the Cambrian came hundreds of millions of years of further evolution, further diversification, further change. The trilobites that dominated the Cambrian Ocean would eventually decline. The small, inconspicuous chordates would eventually rise to dominance. New groups would appear, flourish, and disappear. Mass extinctions would reshape the tree of life again and again, pruning branches and opening space for new growth. And through it all, the basic dynamic established in the Cambrian, the interplay between innovation and constraint, between experimentation and selection, between chance and adaptation, would continue to shape the course of evolution, producing the extraordinary diversity of life that exists today. In the second part of our story, we will follow this dynamic through the hundreds of millions of years that followed the Cambrian, tracing the rise and fall of marine dynasties, the great extinctions that punctuated the history of life, and the eventual emergence of the modern ocean. We will see how the wild experimentation of the Cambrian gave way to a more structured, more constrained, but no less fascinating process of evolutionary refinement. And we will confront the deepest question of all: what does the history of the Cambrian tell us about the nature of life itself? The forgotten ocean has much more to reveal. Its creatures may be gone, but their story, our story, continues. The ancient ocean is not truly forgotten. It lives on in every organism on Earth today, in the body plans we carry, in the genes we inherited, in the ecological relationships that bind us together. We are all children of the Cambrian, whether we know it or not. And understanding the Cambrian is not just an exercise in scientific curiosity. It is an act of self-knowledge. It is a way of understanding where we came from, how we got here, and what forces shaped the world we inhabit. The ocean that existed 500 million years ago was alien, strange, and full of wonders, but it was also, in the deepest sense, our home. It was the crucible in which the foundations of our existence were forged, and its story, however distant, however unfamiliar, is ultimately our story. The story continues. We left the Cambrian Ocean at a moment of extraordinary possibility. The great explosion of biological creativity had filled the seas with creatures of astonishing variety: armored arthropods, grasping predators, soft-bodied wanderers, and the small, quiet chordates that would one day inherit the Earth. The rules of the living world were being written for the first time, and nothing was yet fixed. Nothing was yet certain. The ocean was still a place where experimentation was possible, where a new design could find a foothold, where the future remained genuinely open. But the story of life does not stop at the Cambrian. It cannot. Life, by its very nature, does not stand still. It moves, it changes, it responds to the world around it, and the world around it never stops changing either. The 500 million years that followed the Cambrian explosion are as rich, as dramatic, and as full of wonder as the explosion itself. They are filled with the rise and fall of entire dynasties of creatures, with catastrophes that nearly ended the story of animal life altogether, with innovations so profound that they reshaped the very nature of existence on Earth. This is the second part of that story. It is a story of what happened after the great experiment of the Cambrian, of how the wild diversity of the early ocean was shaped, constrained, tested, and transformed into the world we know today. It is a story of survival and extinction, of innovation and obsolescence, of arms races without end and catastrophes without warning. And it is ultimately a story about the nature of life itself. Please let us know in the comments where you are watching this history video and what time you are watching it. And be sure to subscribe to the channel for future videos. To understand what happened after the Cambrian, we need to first appreciate the world that the Cambrian left behind. By the end of the Cambrian period, roughly 485 million years ago, the ocean was a very different place from what it had been at the beginning. The ecological landscape had been transformed, the food web had been constructed, the major body plans had been established. And a new dynamic, the relentless, escalating interaction between predators and prey, between competitors, between organisms and their environment, was driving evolution forward at a pace that had no precedent. But the Cambrian also left behind a legacy of instability. The extraordinary diversity it had generated was, in many ways, precarious. Many of the lineages that had emerged during the explosion occupied narrow ecological niches, dependent on specific environmental conditions, specific food sources, specific ecological relationships. They were, in the language of ecology, specialists, and specialists, as we have already discussed, are vulnerable to change, and change was coming. The transition from the Cambrian to the Ordovician period, which began roughly 485 million years ago and lasted until about 443 million years ago, was not a sharp break. It was a gradual transition, a slow shift in the composition and character of marine communities. But within this transition, something remarkable happened, a second great explosion of marine diversity, known as the Great Ordovician Biodiversification Event, or GOBA. The GOB was not as dramatic as the Cambrian explosion. It did not produce fundamentally new body plans or novel phyla. The basic architectural frameworks had been established in the Cambrian, and they remained in place. But within those frameworks, the Ordovician produced an extraordinary proliferation of new species, new genera, new families, and new ecological strategies. By some measures, the GOB tripled the diversity of marine life compared to its Cambrian levels. It was, in its own way, another explosion, not of body plans, but of variations on established themes. What drove the GOB? Several factors appear to have been important. Continued rising oxygen levels in the ocean made more environments habitable for complex animals. The breakup of Gondwana and the flooding of continental shelves created new shallow water habitats. Evolutionary innovation within established lineages produced new ecological strategies, new ways of exploiting existing resources, and new relationships between species. But perhaps the most important driver of the GOB was the maturation of the food web itself. In the Cambrian, the food web was a new and somewhat crude structure, with many unfilled niches and underdeveloped ecological relationships. By the Ordovician, the basic structure was in place, but the details were still being filled in. New types of filter feeders evolved to exploit the abundant plankton in the water column. New types of grazers evolved to feed on the algae and microbial mats that covered the seafloor. New types of predators evolved to feed on the expanding diversity of prey organisms. Each new ecological role created opportunities for further specialization, further innovation, further diversification. The food web, in a sense, created its own momentum. As it became more complex, it created more niches, which were filled by more species, which created more interactions, which drove further diversification. This positive feedback loop was the engine of the GOBA, and it drove marine diversity to heights that had never been achieved before. The organisms that benefited most from the GOBA were not the same ones that had dominated the Cambrian. The anomalocaridids, the giant predators of the Cambrian, were declining, their ecological role increasingly taken over by new predators with more sophisticated weaponry. The exotic body plans of the Cambrian, the Opibinias and Hallucigenias and Wiwaxias, were mostly gone, replaced by organisms that fit more neatly into the recognizable categories of the modern animal kingdom. Instead, the Ordovician Ocean was dominated by a different cast of characters. Cephalopods, the group that includes modern squid, octopuses, and nautiluses, were rising to prominence, with their mobile, predatory lifestyle and sophisticated nervous systems making them among the most dangerous hunters in the Ordovician Sea. Brachiopods, filter-feeding creatures with two-valved shells that superficially resembled clams, covered the seafloor in enormous numbers, so abundant that their shells formed thick layers in Ordovician rocks all over the world. Echinoderms, the group that includes modern sea stars, sea urchins, and sea cucumbers, were diversifying rapidly, with the early Ordovician producing an extraordinary array of stalked, filter-feeding forms that waved their arms in the ocean currents to capture food. And the trilobites, those iconic survivors of the Cambrian, continued to evolve and diversify, though their most spectacular period was now behind them. Ordovician trilobites were in many ways more elaborate than their Cambrian ancestors, more ornamented, more specialized, more ecologically varied. Some had evolved bizarre elongated spines and body extensions that served purposes we can only guess at. Others had reduced or lost their eyes entirely, adapting to life in dark, deep-water environments where vision was of no use. The trilobites of the Ordovician were veterans, experienced players in the evolutionary game, their body plan now thoroughly tested and refined. but the Ordovician world, for all its diversity and abundance, was heading toward a catastrophe. At the end of the Ordovician period, roughly 443 million years ago, the Earth experienced the first of what would become a series of mass extinctions, events so devastating that they killed off large fractions of all species on Earth. The end Ordovician mass extinction was caused by a combination of factors, but the primary driver was a dramatic global cooling event associated with the glaciation of Gondwana. As the supercontinent drifted over the South Pole, massive ice sheets formed and spread across its surface. The growth of these ice sheets locked up enormous quantities of water, causing sea levels to fall dramatically. The shallow water habitats that had been so rich and productive during the Ordovician, the warm, sunlit continental shelves where most marine life lived, shrank dramatically. At the same time, the cooling of the ocean reduced the amount of oxygen dissolved in deep water, creating vast oxygen-depleted zones that were lethal to most animal life. The result was catastrophic. Approximately 85% of marine species went extinct during the end Ordovician mass extinction. Entire groups were wiped out. The rich, diverse Ordovician ocean was devastated. When the glaciers eventually retreated and the sea levels rose again, the ocean that remained was a pale shadow of what it had been: impoverished, simplified, with most of its ecological roles vacant. But life, as it always does, recovered. And the recovery from the end Ordovician extinction is itself a remarkable story, because it illustrates one of the fundamental dynamics of life's history, the way in which catastrophe creates opportunity. With most of the ecological space vacated by the extinction, the survivors found themselves in a world of abundant resources and minimal competition. The same dynamic that had driven the Cambrian Explosion, empty niches, abundant opportunity, low competition, was in play again, though on a smaller scale and with a different cast of characters. The surviving lineages began to diversify rapidly, filling the empty niches left by the extinction. This pattern, extinction followed by radiation, devastation followed by recovery, would repeat itself throughout the history of life. It is one of the most important patterns in the entire geological record, and it tells us something fundamental about the relationship between life and environment. Life is both fragile and resilient. It can be devastated by relatively rapid environmental changes, but it also has a remarkable capacity for recovery, for rebuilding complexity from simpler foundations. The period that followed the end Ordovician extinction was the Silurian, lasting from about 443 to 419 million years ago. The Silurian is sometimes overshadowed by the more dramatic periods on either side of it, but it was a time of important innovation and ecological reconstruction. Marine communities gradually rebuilt themselves. New ecological relationships were established. And several groups that would go on to great importance began their rise during the Silurian. Among the most significant developments of the Silurian was the rise of jawed vertebrates. We have already met the earliest chordates, the small, jawless creatures of the Cambrian like Pichia and Haequich. Their jawless descendants, a group called the Agnathans, had diversified during the Ordovician, producing an array of armored fish-like creatures that crawled along the seafloor or filtered food from the water. These early fish were fascinating in their own right, with elaborate armor plating and unusual body shapes, but they were limited by the absence of jaws. The jaw is one of the most important innovations in the history of vertebrate evolution. It transformed fish from relatively passive feeders, limited to filter feeding or scavenging, into active predators capable of seizing and processing a much wider range of prey. The evolution of the jaw opened up new ecological niches that had previously been closed to vertebrates, allowing them to compete directly with the arthropods and cephalopods that had dominated marine predation for millions of years. Where did the jaw come from? This is a question that fascinated scientists for a long time, and the answer, when it came, was both elegant and surprising. The jaw evolved from gill arches, the bony or cartilaginous supports that hold the gill slits open in primitive chordates. In jawless fish, the first pair of gill arches supports the mouth region. In jawed fish, these arches were modified and enlarged, rotating forward and downward to form the upper and lower jaws. It was a brilliant piece of evolutionary recycling, taking an existing structure and repurposing it for an entirely new function. The first jawed fish appeared in the fossil record during the late Ordovician and early Silurian. They were a diverse group, and they quickly split into several major lineages that would each pursue different evolutionary paths. The most successful of these lineages, and the one that would ultimately give rise to all modern jawed vertebrates, including humans, was the bony fish, or Osteichthyans. But before the bony fish came to dominate, another group of jawed fish had its moment in the sun, the placoderms. Placoderms, whose name means plate-skinned, were the first truly dominant jawed vertebrates, and they were, by any measure, extraordinary creatures. They were characterized by a heavy armor of bony plates covering the head and the front part of the body, which gave them a distinctly medieval appearance, like underwater knights clad in articulated plate armor. This armor served primarily as protection against predators and rivals, but it may also have provided a stable framework for the powerful jaw muscles that were one of the defining features of the group. The jaws of placoderms were unlike those of any modern fish. They did not have teeth in the traditional sense. Instead, the bony plates of the jaw itself were sharpened into cutting edges, forming self-sharpening blades that could slice through prey with efficiency. Some placoderms, like Dunkleosteus, used this system to devastating effect. Dunkleosteus was a giant, up to 6 meters long, with a massive skull, powerful neck muscles, and a jaw that could open with extraordinary speed, generating suction that pulled prey directly into the mouth. Its jaw could then snap shut with a force exceeding 5,000 newtons, comparable to that of a large modern crocodile. In the Devonian Ocean, Dunkleosteus was the apex predator, the top of the food chain, the most feared creature in the sea. And the Devonian, the period that followed the Silurian, lasting from roughly 419 to 359 million years ago, was a remarkable time in the history of marine life. Sometimes called the Age of Fishes, the Devonian saw vertebrates rise to true ecological dominance in the ocean for the first time. Fish of all kinds, placoderms, sharks, ray-finned fish, lobe-finned fish, diversified explosively, producing an array of forms that occupied virtually every available ecological niche. The ocean, which had been dominated for hundreds of millions of years by invertebrates, arthropods, mollusks, echinoderms, was being transformed by the rise of the vertebrates. This transition was driven, in large part, by the evolution of the jaw. With jaws, vertebrates could exploit food resources that had been closed to them before. They could prey on larger, more active organisms. They could process tougher food items, shelled mollusks, armored arthropods. They could, in short, compete on equal terms with the other dominant predators of the marine world. And the shark must be mentioned here because sharks are, in their own way, one of the great success stories of evolutionary history. Sharks evolved during the early Devonian, and they have changed remarkably little since then, at least in their basic body plan. The cartilaginous skeleton, the streamlined body, the multiple rows of teeth, the acute sensory systems, these features appeared early in shark evolution and have persisted for 400 million years. This remarkable conservatism is not a sign of evolutionary stagnation. It is a sign of evolutionary success, of a body plan so well suited to its ecological role that further modification provides little or no additional benefit. Sharks were from the beginning superbly efficient predators. Their cartilaginous skeleton was lighter than bone, reducing their energy requirements and allowing them to maintain neutral buoyancy with minimal effort. Their streamlined bodies moved through the water with minimal drag. Their multiple rows of teeth, constantly replaced throughout the animal's lifetime, so that a shark might produce tens of thousands of teeth in its lifespan, ensured that they were never without effective weapons. And their sensory systems were and remain extraordinary. Acute vision, a lateral line system that detects vibrations and pressure changes in the water, electroreceptors that sense the weak electrical fields generated by the muscles and nerves of nearby animals. With all of these advantages, sharks quickly became major players in Devonian marine ecosystems. They occupied the role of fast-swimming, open-water predators, a role that had previously been filled by anomalocaridids and then by placoderms, and they filled it with remarkable efficiency. And unlike the anomalocaridids and the placoderms, sharks did not go extinct. They survived every subsequent mass extinction and are still with us today, largely unchanged in their fundamental design. But the Devonian was not just about marine life. It was also the period during which life made its most dramatic move, the colonization of land. The connection between the Devonian Ocean and the invasion of land is closer than it might appear. The organisms that first walked on land were lobe-finned fish, a group of bony fish characterized by thick, fleshy fins supported by a series of bones that correspond in a modified form to the bones of the limbs of all land vertebrates. The lobe-finned fish that crawled out of the water and onto land did not know they were making history. They were simply following the food, or escaping from predators, or exploring the edge of the water where prey was abundant. But their descendants would go on to populate the land, the sky, and eventually the space beyond. The key innovation that made land colonization possible was the modification of the lobe fin into a limb. The bones of the lobe fin, a humerus, a radius, and ulna, a series of smaller bones corresponding to the wrist and hand, are homologous to the bones of the human arm. They are the same bones, modified by evolution for a different purpose. This discovery that the bones of our limbs trace directly back to the fins of Devonian fish is one of the most powerful demonstrations of evolutionary continuity in all of paleontology. The transition from fin to limb was not a single event. It was a gradual process spanning millions of years, with many intermediate forms that combined fish-like and amphibian-like features. One of the most famous of these intermediate forms is Tiktaalik, discovered in Arctic Canada in 2004. Tiktaalik was a lobe-finned fish. It still had scales, still had gills, still lived primarily in water, but it also had a neck that could move independently of its body, a feature not seen in any modern fish, and fin limbs with wrist-like joints that could have supported its body weight on land. It was, in the words of one of its discoverers, a fish that could do push-ups. Tiktaalik was not the first organism to venture onto land, and it was not the last. It was one participant in a long, gradual process of ecological expansion, as lobe-finned fish increasingly exploited the opportunities offered by the shallow margins of lakes, rivers, and coastal swamps. In these shallow, often oxygen-poor environments, the ability to breathe air directly, using a lung derived from a swim bladder, a feature that was already present in many lobe-finned fish, was a crucial advantage. And the ability to move on land, even clumsily, opened access to food resources, insects, worms, plant material, that were unavailable to purely aquatic creatures. But we are straying from our central subject, which is the ocean. Let us return to the sea. The late Devonian brought another catastrophe, the Devonian mass extinction, actually a series of extinction pulses spread over several million years, centered around 375 to 360 million years ago. This was a complex event, probably caused by multiple factors: volcanic activity, changes in ocean chemistry, a global cooling event, perhaps even the spread of land plants, whose roots released nutrients into rivers and triggered explosive algal growth in coastal seas, depleting the oxygen in the water. Whatever the causes, the result was devastating, particularly for marine life. The placoderms, which had dominated the Devonian Ocean, were virtually wiped out. Of the diverse array of armored fish that had ruled the seas for over 50 million years, almost none survived the end of the Devonian. The ancient lineage that had produced Dunkleosteus and its kin simply ended, leaving behind only fossils. The ecological niches that the placoderms had occupied were left vacant, ready to be filled by whatever survivors could adapt to the new conditions. And again, as after the Ordovician extinction, life recovered. The survivors of the Devonian extinction, sharks, ray-finned fish, lobe-finned fish, and a diverse array of invertebrates, found themselves in a world of diminished competition and abundant opportunity. They diversified, they innovated, they filled the empty niches, and slowly, over millions of years, the ocean rebuilt itself. The Carboniferous period that followed, lasting from roughly 359 to 299 million years ago, was a time of remarkable ecological recovery and diversification. The ocean was warm, oxygen-rich, and increasingly productive. Marine communities rebuilt their complexity. New ecological relationships were established, and several groups that would go on to great importance, including the ancestors of modern bony fish, continued their diversification. Among the most significant developments of the Carboniferous was the continued rise and diversification of sharks. Released from competition with the placoderms, Carboniferous sharks proliferated into an extraordinary variety of forms. Some were streamlined, fast-swimming open-water predators, ancestral to modern sharks. Others were bizarre, with strange head ornaments, unusual tooth shapes, and ecological lifestyles that we can barely guess at. One group, the Eugeniodontids, had spiral tooth whorls on their lower jaws, a unique and highly unusual dental structure that has no parallel in any modern animal. Another group, the Cochleodontids, had flat, crushing teeth suited for feeding on hard-shelled invertebrates. The Carboniferous was in a sense the golden age of sharks, a period of extraordinary shark diversity that would not be matched until the modern era. The cephalopods, too, were diversifying in remarkable ways. The ammonites, cephalopods with coiled external shells, first appeared in the Devonian and began their long diversification during the Carboniferous. Ammonites would go on to become one of the most successful and diverse groups in the history of marine life, producing thousands of species over a span of more than 300 million years. Their shells, with their distinctive chambered structure and often elaborate external ornamentation, are among the most beautiful and recognizable fossils in the world. But ammonites were not just beautiful, they were ecologically important. They occupied a range of predatory niches in the ocean, from surface waters to considerable depths. Their ability to adjust their buoyancy by changing the gas content of their shell chambers made them highly mobile, capable of moving up and down through the water column and pursuing prey at different depths. And their rapid rate of evolutionary change, ammonite species typically lasted only a few million years before being replaced by new species, makes them extraordinarily useful as index fossils, allowing geologists to date the rocks in which they are found with remarkable precision. The Permian period, which followed the Carboniferous and lasted from roughly 299 to 252 million years ago, was in many ways the culmination of the Paleozoic era, the long chapter of Earth history that had begun with the Cambrian Explosion. Marine communities had reached levels of diversity and ecological complexity that rivaled anything seen today. Coral reefs had expanded dramatically, providing habitat for an extraordinary array of species. The seafloor was covered with dense communities of brachiopods, echinoderms, and mollusks. Cephalopods cruised the open water, sharks patrolled the reefs, ray-finned fish were diversifying rapidly. By any measure, the Permian Ocean was a thriving, complex, productive system. It was in many ways the culmination of 500 million years of evolutionary progress, the product of all the experiments, all the innovations, all the adaptations that had accumulated since the Cambrian. And then it was nearly destroyed. The end Permian mass extinction, sometimes called the Great Dying, is the most devastating biological catastrophe in the history of animal life. It occurred approximately 252 million years ago, and it killed off an estimated 90 to 96% of all marine species. Not 90% of individuals, 90 to 96% of species. Entire groups that had been successful for hundreds of millions of years simply ceased to exist. The trilobites, which had survived multiple mass extinctions and persisted for nearly 300 million years, were finally wiped out. The rugose and tabulate corals, which had built the Paleozoic reef systems, went extinct. The vast majority of brachiopod lineages disappeared. Countless other groups, ammonite lineages, echinoderm lineages, fish lineages, were devastated. What caused the end Permian extinction? Scientists have debated this question for decades, and the current consensus points to a massive episode of volcanic activity in what is now Siberia, the Siberian Traps, as the primary driver. Over a period of perhaps a million years, extraordinary volumes of basaltic magma erupted from the Siberian Traps, covering an area the size of a modern continent with lava. This volcanic activity released enormous quantities of carbon dioxide, sulfur dioxide, and other gases into the atmosphere, triggering a cascade of environmental changes. Carbon dioxide levels skyrocketed, causing intense global warming. Temperatures rose by as much as 10 degrees Celsius or more. The warmer atmosphere held more water vapor, intensifying the greenhouse effect. Ocean temperatures rose dramatically. Warmer water holds less dissolved oxygen, so the ocean became increasingly anoxic, low in oxygen, particularly in deeper water. Ocean chemistry changed as well. The water became more acidic as it absorbed atmospheric carbon dioxide, dissolving the calcium carbonate shells of marine invertebrates and making it difficult or impossible for organisms to build new ones. The result was a perfect storm of environmental catastrophe. Hot, acidic, oxygen-depleted oceans were simply incompatible with the survival of most marine species. Organisms that had thrived under the conditions of the Paleozoic ocean found themselves in an environment for which they had no adaptations, no defenses, no escape. They died, in vast numbers, across every environment, every depth, every latitude. The end Permian extinction was not instantaneous. It played out over perhaps tens of thousands of years, but in geological terms it was effectively sudden. When it was over, the ocean was a shadow of its former self. The diverse, complex, ecologically rich Permian marine world had been reduced to a small number of surviving lineages, struggling in a depleted, disturbed, chemically hostile ocean. The recovery from the end Permian extinction was slow, far slower than recovery from earlier extinctions. For millions of years after the event, marine communities remained impoverished and ecologically simplified. The reason for this prolonged delay is still being studied, but it probably reflects the severity of the environmental disruption. The ocean did not simply return to its pre-extinction state after the volcanic activity ceased. The disruption of biogeochemical cycles, the cycles that regulate the flow of carbon, oxygen, and nutrients through the ocean, took millions of years to repair, but repair it did. Slowly, painfully, the ocean rebuilt itself. New coral reefs, built by a different group of corals, the scleractinian corals that form modern reefs, began to grow. New ecological communities assembled themselves, drawing on the surviving lineages and gradually filling the vacant niches. New evolutionary innovations appeared as the survivors diversified into the empty ecological space. The world that emerged from the end Permian extinction was not the same as the world that had gone before. It was a world rebuilt on a narrower foundation, a world populated by the descendants of the small fraction of lineages that had survived the catastrophe. Many of the groups that had characterized the Paleozoic ocean, the trilobites, the rugose corals, the vast majority of brachiopod lineages, were gone forever. Their ecological roles were filled by different organisms, with different body plans and different ecological strategies. In the ocean, the most significant change was the rise of the modern marine fauna. The Paleozoic marine world had been dominated by brachiopods, crinoids, and other filter feeders attached to the seafloor, by trilobites crawling across the bottom, by ancient sharks and early bony fish in the water column. The post-Permian world would be dominated by mollusks, clams, snails, and cephalopods, by modern bony fish, the teleosts, and by modern sharks and rays. The shift from the Paleozoic marine fauna to the modern marine fauna is one of the most dramatic faunal replacements in the history of life, and it was driven in large part by the end Permian extinction. The Triassic period that followed the extinction, lasting from 252 to 201 million years ago, was a time of gradual recovery, of rebuilding and experimentation. New ecological strategies appeared, new groups rose to prominence. And importantly, one group of marine reptiles began its rise that would eventually produce some of the largest and most impressive creatures ever to swim in the ocean. The marine reptiles of the Mesozoic era, the ichthyosaurs, plesiosaurs, mosasaurs, and their relatives, were among the most spectacular animals ever to inhabit the ocean. They were not fish. They were reptiles descended from land-dwelling ancestors who had secondarily returned to the water, much as whales would do much later. And in their anatomy, they still bore the marks of their terrestrial ancestry. They had to breathe air, they were warm-blooded or warm-blooded adjacent, and they retained the four-limbed body plan of their land-living forebears, modified into flippers. The ichthyosaurs are perhaps the most remarkable of these marine reptiles, because their evolution represents a stunning example of convergent evolution, the independent evolution of similar features in unrelated lineages in response to similar ecological pressures. Ichthyosaurs were in many ways remarkably fish-like. They had streamlined, torpedo-shaped bodies, tail flukes for propulsion, dorsal fins for stability, and large eyes for hunting in the water. They were so fish-like that early fossil discoveries were often misidentified as fish. But they were reptiles, and their fish-like features evolved independently of fish, driven by the same physical demands of fast, efficient swimming in open water. The eyes of ichthyosaurs deserve special mention. Some ichthyosaurs had the largest eyes of any known vertebrate, reaching 30 centimeters or more in diameter. Eyes this large were almost certainly adaptations for hunting in low-light conditions, either deep water or the dim light of early morning and late evening. They suggest that ichthyosaurs were deep divers, capable of pursuing prey at depths where little light penetrated. The evolution of such extreme eyes in these creatures parallels the evolution of large eyes in modern deep-diving creatures like giant squid and swordfish, and it illustrates once again how similar ecological challenges produce similar evolutionary solutions. The plesiosaurs occupied a different ecological niche from the ichthyosaurs. Instead of streamlined, high-speed pursuit predators, plesiosaurs were generally slower, more maneuverable hunters, using their four large flippers to fly through the water in a manner similar to modern sea turtles or penguins. They came in two basic body types, the short-necked, large-headed plesiosauromorphs, which were ambush predators with massive jaws, and the long-necked plesiosaurs, which used their extraordinarily elongated necks to strike at fish and other prey with rapid, snake-like movements. The plesiosaurs, particularly the long-necked forms, have captured human imagination for centuries. Their distinctive body plan, a small head on an enormously long neck, a compact body supported by four large flippers, and a short tail, is unlike that of any modern animal, and it has inspired countless mythological sea monsters and cryptid legends. But they were real and they were successful for over 100 million years, occupying important ecological roles in Mesozoic marine ecosystems. The Mesozoic era, the Triassic, Jurassic, and Cretaceous periods, spanning from 252 to 66 million years ago, is often called the Age of Reptiles, and on land, reptiles certainly dominated in the form of dinosaurs. But in the ocean, the story is more complex. Marine reptiles were important and ecologically significant, but they shared the ocean with a remarkable diversity of other organisms. Modern-type bony fish, sharks, ammonites, belemnites, enormous marine crocodilians, and the ancestors of modern marine invertebrates. The Mesozoic Ocean was, in many ways, a more familiar place than the Cambrian or even the Paleozoic Ocean. The basic ecological structure, phytoplankton at the base of the food web, filter feeders and herbivores in the middle trophic levels, predators at the top, was the same structure that characterizes modern oceans. The specific organisms were different, but the roles they played were analogous to those played by modern species. This ecological familiarity reflects the fact that the post-Permian world was, in important ways, the world we still live in. The mass extinctions of the Paleozoic had pruned the tree of life, removing many of the ancient lineages that had characterized the earlier ocean. What survived was the stock from which the modern world was built, the ancestors of the teleost fish, the modern sharks, the modern mollusks, the modern echinoderms. The Mesozoic was the period during which these groups diversified and established the ecological dominance that they maintain today. But the Mesozoic had its own catastrophe waiting at the end Cretaceous mass extinction, 66 million years ago, caused by the impact of a large asteroid on what is now the Yucatan Peninsula in Mexico. This event, whose effects are now well documented in the geological record, ended the reign of the non-avian dinosaurs and caused the extinction of many other groups, both on land and in the sea. In the ocean, the ammonites, which had survived every previous mass extinction for over 300 million years, finally went extinct. The mosasaurs, the plesiosaurs, and many other marine reptiles disappeared. Numerous lineages of fish, invertebrates, and plankton went extinct. But the end Cretaceous extinction, devastating as it was less severe than the end Permian. Approximately 50 to 75% of species went extinct, compared to the 90 to 96% of the Permian extinction. And the recovery was faster, partly because the surviving lineages were in many cases better adapted to a wide range of conditions, and partly because the environmental disruption, though severe, was not as prolonged as that caused by the Siberian traps volcanism. In the ocean, the most significant post-Cretaceous development was the explosive diversification of the teleost fish. Teleosts, the group that includes most of the fish familiar to us today, from salmon and tuna to clownfish and seahorses, had existed since the Triassic, but they had been relatively minor players in Mesozoic marine ecosystems. After the end Cretaceous extinction, released from competition with the mosasaurs, plesiosaurs, and the more advanced ammonites, teleosts diversified explosively. Within 10 to 20 million years of the extinction, they had established the ecological dominance that they maintain today, occupying virtually every available marine niche from shallow coastal waters to the deep ocean. The diversification of the teleosts was driven by a set of anatomical innovations that made them extraordinarily versatile. Among the most important was the evolution of the protrusible jaw, a jaw that can be projected forward when the mouth opens, increasing the speed of the strike and the size of the gape. This seemingly minor innovation had profound ecological consequences. It allowed teleosts to capture a much wider range of prey, including organisms that could not be caught by fish with fixed jaws. The protrusible jaw is one of the reasons why teleosts have diversified into so many different ecological niches and feeding strategies. Other teleost innovations included the evolution of the swimbladder, a gas-filled internal organ that allows fish to maintain neutral buoyancy without continuous swimming, greatly reducing their energy expenditure. The evolution of more flexible fin structures, allowing greater maneuverability and precision of movement. The evolution of elaborate sensory systems, including highly developed lateral lines and color vision in many groups. Together, these innovations made teleosts the most diverse and ecologically successful group of vertebrates in the history of the Earth. There are over 30,000 species of teleost fish alive today, more species than all other vertebrate groups combined. They live in virtually every aquatic habitat on the planet, from the deepest ocean trenches to high-altitude mountain lakes, from tropical coral reefs to the frigid waters beneath Antarctic sea ice. And yet, as successful as the teleosts are, they are not the dominant creatures in the modern ocean's imagination. That role belongs to the marine mammals, the whales, dolphins, seals, sea lions, walruses, and manatees that inhabit the sea today. These animals, like the Mesozoic marine reptiles before them, are secondarily aquatic, descended from land-dwelling ancestors who returned to the water and were subsequently reshaped by the demands of aquatic life. The origin of whales is one of the most dramatic evolutionary stories in the entire history of life, and it unfolded during the Eocene epoch, roughly 50 to 35 million years ago. The ancestors of whales were land mammals, hoofed animals, related to modern hippos and deer, that began to exploit the resources of rivers and shallow coastal waters. Over millions of years, these creatures became increasingly aquatic, their hind limbs gradually diminishing as their bodies became more streamlined, their forelimbs transforming into flippers, their nostrils migrating to the top of the skull to form a blowhole. This transformation is documented in extraordinary detail in the fossil record. We have fossils of every major stage in the transition from land mammal to fully aquatic whale. Pachycetus, a wolf-sized hoofed animal that probably waded in shallow water. Ambulocetus, which could walk on land but was also an effective swimmer. Rhodhostis, which had reduced hind limbs and was primarily aquatic. And finally the basilosaurids, which were fully aquatic, with a streamlined body, vestigial hind limbs too small to support their weight on land, and a tail fluke for propulsion. The evolution of whales is a reminder that the ocean is not just a place of ancient life. It is also a place of continuing innovation, of ongoing evolutionary experimentation. The sea is never finished. It is always changing, always producing new solutions to the challenges of aquatic existence. And the challenges of the deep ocean, the vast, dark, cold, high-pressure environment that covers more than half the Earth's surface, have produced some of the most extraordinary adaptations in the history of life. Deep-sea organisms live in conditions that are, by any human standard, extreme. No sunlight, crushing pressures, near freezing temperatures, and food supplies that are sparse and unpredictable. Yet the deep ocean is teeming with life, bizarre, alien life, adapted in remarkable ways to its harsh environment. The anglerfish, with its bioluminescent lure dangling before its enormous mouth, is perhaps the most iconic example of deep-sea adaptation. In the perpetual darkness of the deep ocean, bioluminescence, the production of light by living organisms, is a crucial ecological tool. It is used to attract prey, as in the anglerfish. It is used for communication between members of the same species. It is used as a defense. Some organisms produce bright flashes of light to startle predators. And it is used as camouflage. Many deep-sea animals have photophores, light-producing organs, on their undersides that match the faint light filtering down from above, making them invisible to predators looking up from below. Bioluminescence has evolved independently in at least 40 different lineages of marine organisms: bacteria, dinoflagellates, jellyfish, squid, fish, and more. This convergent evolution of the same capability in so many different lineages speaks to its ecological value. In the dark ocean, light is a powerful tool, and evolution has found ways to produce it again and again. The giant squid Architeuthis dux is another icon of the deep ocean, and it deserves mention here because it connects us back to the Cambrian. The cephalopods, the group to which giant squid, octopuses, and nautiluses belong, trace their ancestry back to the early Cambrian, when the first shelled mollusks with internal chambers appeared in the fossil record. From these humble beginnings, the cephalopods developed into the most intelligent, most behaviorally sophisticated invertebrates in the history of life. Modern octopuses have complex nervous systems, remarkable learning abilities, and problem-solving skills that rival those of many vertebrates. They are, in a very real sense, the most sophisticated legacy of the Cambrian mollusks, the end point of over 500 million years of cephalopod evolution. The giant squid takes this legacy to a physical extreme. It is the largest invertebrate on Earth, reaching lengths of 13 meters or more. Its eyes, the largest of any known animal, up to 30 centimeters in diameter, give it the visual acuity needed to hunt in the dim light of the deep ocean. And its arms and tentacles, lined with hundreds of suckers armed with sharp, claw-like hooks, make it a formidable predator capable of capturing large prey, including other squid. The giant squid is also the prey of the sperm whale, the largest toothed predator in the history of life. Sperm whales dive to depths of over 3,000 meters in pursuit of giant squid, holding their breath for up to 90 minutes. The encounter between a sperm whale and a giant squid, two of the largest animals on Earth, engaged in mortal combat in the darkness of the deep ocean, is one of the most dramatic ecological interactions on the planet, and it remains largely unseen by human eyes. Both combatants bear the marks of their struggles. Sperm whales often carry the sucker scars of giant squid on their skin, while giant squid are frequently found with the tooth marks of sperm whales. This interaction, predator and prey, locked in an escalating arms race in the depths of the ocean, is a direct echo of the very first predator-prey interactions of the Cambrian. The dynamic is the same. One organism evolves more effective weapons, the other evolves more effective defenses. The organisms are different, the scale is different, the setting is different, but the fundamental dynamic, established in the Cambrian Ocean 500 million years ago, persists unchanged. Now let us consider one of the most important structures in the modern ocean, one that connects us directly to the ecological innovations of the Cambrian and Paleozoic, the coral reef. Coral reefs are the most biodiverse marine ecosystems on Earth. Though they cover less than 1% of the ocean floor, they are home to approximately 25% of all marine species. They are built primarily by stony corals, cnidarians, related to sea anemones and jellyfish, that secrete calcium carbonate skeletons and grow together in enormous colonies. Over thousands of years, these colonies accumulate into massive reef structures that can extend for hundreds of kilometers. The history of reef building is a long and complex one, and it illustrates beautifully the theme of ecological continuity and change that runs through the entire history of marine life. The Cambrian had its reefs, structures built not by corals but by archaeocyathidds, sponge-like organisms that constructed calcium carbonate frameworks and were the first true reef builders in the history of life. The archaeocyathid reefs were the dominant reef structures of the early Cambrian, and they supported diverse communities of associated organisms. But the archaeocyathids went extinct by the Middle Cambrian, and the reef-building role passed to other organisms. During the Ordovician and Silurian, reefs were built by tabulate and rugose corals, ancient coral groups, very different from modern corals that formed the backbone of Paleozoic reef systems. These Paleozoic reefs were as diverse and productive as modern reefs, supporting rich communities of brachiopods, crinoids, trilobites, and other organisms. They persisted for hundreds of millions of years through multiple extinction events until the end Permian extinction finally wiped them out. The modern coral reef system was built by the Scleractinian corals, a group with no clear relationship to the Paleozoic corals that appeared in the Triassic and gradually established themselves as the dominant reef builders. Modern coral reefs are thus not the direct descendants of Paleozoic reefs, but rather a parallel construction, a functionally similar system built by a completely different group of organisms. The ecological role is the same, but the builders have changed entirely. This is another example of the ecological convergence that runs throughout the history of life. The same ecological roles, reef builder, filter feeder, apex predator, burrowing detritivore, appear again and again in the fossil record, filled by different organisms in different periods. The role persists because the ecological opportunity persists. The organisms that fill the role change because evolution, combined with the chance events of extinction and radiation, produces new solutions to the same ecological problems. This principle, the persistence of ecological roles even as the organisms that fill them change, is one of the most fundamental insights of paleontology. It tells us that ecosystems have a kind of ecological memory, a set of functional requirements that must be met regardless of which specific organisms are doing the meeting. Remove an organism from an ecosystem and another will eventually evolve to fill its role. The face changes but the role remains. This is both comforting and sobering. Comforting because it suggests that ecosystems are resilient, that they can recover from even the most devastating extinctions, given enough time. Sobering because it reminds us that no species, however dominant, is irreplaceable. The trilobites ruled the ocean for nearly 300 million years and then they were gone. The placoderms dominated Devonian seas and then they were gone. The ammonites survived 5 mass extinctions before finally succumbing to the 6th. Even the most successful organisms are mortal in an evolutionary sense. Their time will end. The question of what comes after, what fills the ecological roles left vacant by each extinction, is one of the most interesting in all of evolutionary biology. And the answer, consistently, is whatever survives, whatever happens to be present when the ecological space opens up. The survivors of each extinction inherit the vacant world, and from them the next chapter of life is written. This brings us back to a theme we introduced in the first part of our story, contingency. The history of life is contingent, dependent on the particular sequence of events that actually occurred, rather than on any predetermined plan or direction. The organisms that dominate the modern ocean are not there because they were destined to be there. They are there because they happened to survive the particular sequence of catastrophes that eliminated their competitors, and because they had the genetic and ecological flexibility to diversify into the resulting empty space. Change any one event in that sequence, prevent the end Permian extinction, or the end Cretaceous extinction, or any of the other mass extinctions that have punctuated the history of life, and the result would be a different ocean, populated by different organisms with a different ecological structure. The teleost fish that dominate modern oceans might never have risen to dominance. The modern coral reef system might never have developed. The whales and dolphins that we regard as the icons of the modern ocean might never have evolved, and yet the ocean would not be empty. Life, we can be confident, would still be there, filling the available ecological roles, pursuing the same fundamental activities of feeding, reproducing, competing, and cooperating. The specific organisms would be different, but the ecological structure would be recognizably similar, because the ecological structure of the ocean is ultimately determined by the physics and chemistry of the marine environment, by the availability of sunlight, nutrients, and oxygen, by the gradients of temperature, pressure, and salinity that structure the water column, by the geography of continents and ocean basins. These physical and chemical constraints are the ultimate determinants of what kinds of ecosystems are possible. Within those constraints, evolution can produce an enormous variety of specific solutions, an enormous diversity of organisms and ecological relationships. But the constraints themselves are fixed by the nature of the Earth, and they have remained remarkably constant throughout the history of life, even as the specific organisms that inhabit the ocean have changed repeatedly and dramatically. This is one of the deepest insights of the study of ancient marine life. The ocean is both the product of its history, shaped by the particular sequence of events that have unfolded over 500 million years, and a response to eternal physical and chemical laws that have governed it since its formation. It is, in the most profound sense, both contingent and necessary. Let us now consider the evolution of one more crucial feature of the Cambrian and post-Cambrian ocean, the development of sensory systems beyond vision. We have already discussed the evolution of image-forming vision in the Cambrian and its transformative effects on marine ecology, but vision is not the only sense that marine animals rely on. In fact, in many marine environments, particularly the deep ocean, where light does not penetrate, vision is of limited use. Other senses have evolved to fill the gap, and some of them are so different from anything in human experience that they challenge our ability to fully imagine what it is like to perceive the world through them. The lateral line system, which we have already briefly mentioned in connection with sharks, is one of the most important of these non-visual senses. The lateral line is a system of sensory organs called neuromasts arranged in a line along the sides of a fish, often connected by a canal system beneath the skin. These organs detect vibrations and pressure changes in the surrounding water, allowing the fish to sense movement nearby, to detect obstacles, and to coordinate behavior within schools. The lateral line is, in a sense, a distributed touch sense, a way of feeling the water around the body, even at distances of several body lengths. The lateral line evolved early in vertebrate history. It is present in the most primitive living fish, and it is thought to have been present in the earliest vertebrates. It is also present in some amphibians and in the larval stages of many aquatic vertebrates. In the dark, turbid waters where many fish live, the lateral line may be as important as vision, or more so. Even more remarkable is the electroreceptive sense. Many fish, sharks, rays, electric fish, and others can detect the weak electrical fields generated by the muscles and nerves of other organisms. These electrical fields are present in all living things, but they are normally too weak to detect without sensitive instruments. Electroreceptors, specialized sensory organs found in the skin of electroreceptive animals, can detect fields as weak as a few nanovolts per centimeter. For sharks, this sense is used in hunting. When a prey organism is buried in the sediment or hidden in a crevice, the shark can still detect its presence through its electrical activity. The shark does not see the prey, does not hear it, does not smell it. It feels the faint electrical signature of its heartbeat and muscle contractions, and homes in on that signal. This is a hunting strategy with no parallel in the terrestrial world, and it speaks to the extraordinary diversity of sensory solutions that evolution has found for the challenge of finding food in the ocean. Some fish take this one step further, generating their own electric fields, either weak fields used for navigation and communication, or powerful fields used for stunning prey and deterring predators. Electric eels can generate discharges of up to 800 volts, enough to stun large animals. Electric rays produce discharges used to immobilize prey. Even weakly electric fish generate continuous fields that they use to sense their surroundings and communicate with each other, a kind of electrical language that is completely outside human perception. The evolution of these extraordinary sensory systems is, in many ways, a continuation of the sensory revolution that began in the Cambrian. The evolution of eyes in the Cambrian transformed the ecology of the ocean, creating new dynamics of pursuit and evasion, new arms races between predators and prey. The subsequent evolution of lateral lines, electroreception, echolocation, in the case of marine mammals like dolphins and whales, and other sophisticated sensory systems represents a continued expansion of the sensory landscape of the ocean, a continued elaboration of the ways in which marine organisms perceive and interact with their world. And each expansion of the sensory landscape creates new ecological opportunities and new selective pressures. Dolphins evolved echolocation, the ability to produce high-frequency sound pulses and interpret the returning echoes to create a detailed sonic image of their surroundings. They gained the ability to hunt in complete darkness, to detect prey hidden in the sediment, to communicate and coordinate with other dolphins over distances of many kilometers. Echolocation transformed the dolphin's ecological niche, allowing it to exploit resources that were inaccessible to organisms without this capability. This pattern, a new sensory capability opening new ecological possibilities, driving new evolutionary innovations, is another echo of the Cambrian. The Cambrian was the period when the fundamental sensory toolkit of marine animals was first assembled. The subsequent history of marine life has been, in part, a story of the continued elaboration and refinement of that toolkit, of the discovery of new ways to perceive a world that is far richer in information than any single sensory system can fully capture. Now let us turn to the question of stability and its consequences. We have spent much of our story discussing change, the explosive diversification of the Cambrian, the rise and fall of dynasties, the transformation of ecosystems by mass extinction and recovery. But the history of marine life is also a story of stability, of ecological relationships and body plans that have persisted, largely unchanged, for hundreds of millions of years. The nautilus is perhaps the most famous example of this biological conservatism. The nautilus, a shelled cephalopod that swims through the ocean using jet propulsion, capturing prey with its many tentacles, has changed remarkably little in the past 400 million years. Fossil nautiloids from the Devonian are virtually indistinguishable from modern nautiluses. The basic body plan, coiled chambered shell, hood of tissue covering the opening, cluster of tentacles around the mouth, simple eyes without lenses, has remained stable through 400 million years of environmental change, through multiple mass extinctions, through the rise and fall of countless other marine groups. Why has the nautilus changed so little? The answer is probably related to its ecological niche and its life history. Nautiluses are not specialists. They are generalists capable of feeding on a wide variety of prey, living across a range of depths, and surviving in a variety of environmental conditions. This generalism makes them somewhat resilient to environmental change, not perfectly adapted to any specific set of conditions, but adequately adapted to many different sets of conditions. When conditions change, nautiluses can adjust their behavior without needing to change their body plan. Horseshoe crab is another famous example of biological conservatism. These ancient arthropods, which, despite their name, are more closely related to spiders and scorpions than to true crabs, have remained essentially unchanged for over 450 million years. The modern horseshoe crab is so similar to its Ordovician ancestors that it is often called a living fossil, though this term is somewhat misleading. Horseshoe crabs are not static. They have evolved slowly in many details. But their basic body plan, the dome-shaped carapace, the compound eyes on either side of the head shield, the spike-like tail, the 5 pairs of walking legs, has been maintained with remarkable fidelity across nearly 500 million years. The coelacanth fish is perhaps the most famous living fossil of all. Long thought to be extinct, their closest relatives in the fossil record appeared to die out 65 million years ago. Coelacanths were rediscovered in 1938 when a live specimen was caught off the coast of South Africa. The modern coelacanth is so similar to its fossil relatives that it caused a sensation in the scientific world. Here was a creature that had apparently survived, essentially unchanged, for hundreds of millions of years, while the world around it was transformed beyond recognition by mass extinctions, continental movements, and the rise and fall of entire dynasties of organisms. What does the existence of living fossils tell us about evolution? It tells us that evolutionary change is not inevitable. It is not a constant, relentless pressure that transforms all organisms over time. Evolution is a response to selection pressure, to the need to adapt to changing conditions. If conditions are stable enough, and if a body plan is flexible enough to accommodate whatever changes do occur, then there may be no pressure to change. The organisms that have remained most stable over geological time are, in general, those that occupy stable, generalized ecological niches and have sufficiently flexible behavioral and physiological repertoires to cope with the inevitable minor fluctuations in their environment. This is not passivity or failure to evolve. It is in its own way a form of evolutionary success, the maintenance of a viable design across vast stretches of time. The horseshoe crab, the nautilus, the coelacanth, these organisms are not evolutionary failures. They are evolutionary survivors, creatures whose designs have proven so adequate to the demands of their ecological niches that the selective pressure for further change has been insufficient to alter them fundamentally. But stability, like specialization, has its risks. An organism adapted to stable conditions may be particularly vulnerable to sudden, dramatic change. The living fossils of today exist in a world that is changing at a rate unprecedented in the recent geological record, not because of volcanic eruptions or asteroid impacts, but because of human activity. And the question of whether creatures like the coelacanth and the horseshoe crab, which have survived every natural catastrophe of the past 400 million years, will survive the ecological disruptions of the next 100 years, is one of the most urgent questions facing conservation biology. But let us return to the deeper past, and to a development that would prove transformative not only for the ocean but for the entire planet, the evolution of complex ecological interactions and the maturation of the marine food web. We have already discussed the basic structure of the marine food web, the producers, consumers, and decomposers that form the functional backbone of marine ecosystems. But the full complexity of the modern marine food web is far greater than the simple three-level structure suggests. Modern marine ecosystems are characterized by intricate webs of ecological interaction, predation, competition, mutualism, parasitism, commensalism, and dozens of other types of relationship that connect thousands of species in complex, interacting networks. Many of these interactions have deep evolutionary roots, stretching back through hundreds of millions of years. The mutualistic relationship between reef-building corals and the photosynthetic algae, zooxanthellae, that live within their tissues is thought to have been established in the Triassic or Jurassic. The intricate relationships between cleaner fish and their clients, the associations between clownfish and sea anemones, the complex interactions between sea otters and sea urchins and kelp, all of these represent ecological relationships with deep evolutionary histories, shaped by millions of years of coevolution. Coevolution, the mutual evolutionary influence of two or more species on one another, is one of the most powerful forces shaping the diversity and complexity of modern marine ecosystems. When a predator evolves more effective hunting tools, the prey evolves more effective defenses. When a mutualist evolves to be more effective, its partner evolves to exploit the mutualism more fully. These coevolutionary interactions drive the diversification of both partners, producing an increasing refinement and specialization of ecological relationships over time. The most extreme examples of coevolution in the ocean are found among parasites and their hosts. Marine parasites are astonishingly diverse. Essentially, every marine organism is host to one or more parasitic species, and the evolutionary arms race between parasite and host is one of the most intense and consequential in all of biology. Hosts evolve immune responses and behavioral defenses to resist parasites. Parasites evolve counter-defenses to overcome host immunity. The result is a never-ending cycle of co-evolutionary innovation, driving rapid genetic change in both parasite and host. This co-evolutionary arms race between parasites and hosts may, in fact, be one of the major drivers of genetic diversity in marine populations. Sexual reproduction, the mixing of genetic material from two parents to produce offspring with new genetic combinations, is thought to be partly an adaptation to parasitism. It produces offspring that are genetically novel and therefore harder for parasites to exploit because the parasites have been adapted to overcome the defenses of the parent generation. If this hypothesis is correct, then the pervasive reality of parasitism in the ocean may be one of the reasons why sexual reproduction is so nearly universal among complex marine organisms. The evolution of ecological complexity, of intricate food webs, co-evolutionary relationships, and diverse ecological interactions, is another way in which the ocean has continued to become more sophisticated over its 500 million year history. The Cambrian Ocean had a food web, but it was a relatively simple one, with limited diversity of ecological interactions. The modern ocean has a food web of extraordinary complexity, with thousands of interacting species, dozens of trophic levels, and ecological relationships of almost infinite variety. This increasing complexity is not accidental. It is the product of millions of years of ecological and evolutionary interaction, of co-evolutionary dynamics that have progressively elaborated and refined the structure of marine communities. The modern ocean is, in a very real sense, the accumulated product of 500 million years of ecological history, 500 million years of predation, competition, cooperation, and co-evolution. And this brings us to one of the most important and sobering points in our entire story: the fragility of this accumulated complexity in the face of rapid change. The history of life teaches us that complex ecological systems, built up over millions of years, can be devastated in geological instants. The end Permian extinction destroyed the complex Paleozoic marine ecosystem in what was, geologically speaking, a moment. The end Cretaceous extinction did the same for the Mesozoic marine world. Each of these catastrophes required millions of years for ecological complexity to be rebuilt, and what was rebuilt was never quite the same as what had been destroyed. This lesson that ecological complexity is fragile, that it can be rapidly destroyed and only slowly rebuilt, is one of the deepest insights of the study of ancient marine life. It is relevant not only to the past, but to the present and the future. The modern ocean is undergoing changes at a rate that has few precedents in the geological record. Ocean temperatures are rising, ocean chemistry is changing, the water is becoming more acidic as it absorbs carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, threatening the ability of corals and other calcifying organisms to build their skeletons. Oxygen levels in many parts of the ocean are declining, creating expanding dead zones where most animal life cannot survive. Overfishing has removed apex predators and disrupted food webs that evolved over millions of years. Pollution has introduced chemicals that have no natural precedent in the marine environment. These changes are not yet as severe as the changes that drove the great mass extinctions of the past. But the rate of change, the speed at which ocean conditions are shifting, is, by some measures, faster than anything seen in the geological record outside of the immediate aftermath of catastrophic events like asteroid impacts and supervolcanic eruptions. And rate of change matters as much as magnitude. Organisms can adapt to gradual change over millions of years. They cannot adapt to rapid change over decades or centuries. The question of whether the modern ocean, with its extraordinary complexity, its intricate food webs, its millions of species accumulated over 500 million years of evolutionary history, can withstand the pace of change currently being imposed on it is one of the most urgent and consequential questions of our time. The history of the ancient ocean does not provide a comforting answer. What it provides instead is perspective, a deep understanding of what is at stake. The organisms that live in the modern ocean are not just species. They are the surviving endpoints of lineages that stretch back hundreds of millions of years. Every species of fish, every species of coral, every species of cephalopod carries within it the accumulated evolutionary history of the Cambrian and everything that followed. They are the heirs of the great experiment. They are the living legacy of the forgotten ocean, and they are irreplaceable. Not in the short term, some species are replaceable on ecological timescales of decades or centuries. But the lineages they represent, the evolutionary history they embody, the unique combinations of features they have developed over millions of years, these cannot be replaced on any timescale meaningful to human civilization. When a species goes extinct, its lineage goes extinct with it. The millions of years of evolutionary history that produced it are erased. The possibilities it embodied are closed off forever. This is why the study of the ancient ocean matters, not as an academic exercise, not as mere curiosity about the past, but as a way of understanding the value of what exists today and the consequences of losing it. The Cambrian taught us that life is creative beyond imagination. The subsequent 500 million years taught us that creativity must be sustained, that it can be destroyed, and that rebuilding what is lost takes an almost incomprehensible amount of time. The living ocean of today is the product of all of that creativity, all of that time, all of that history. It deserves to be understood for what it is, not a background resource, not a source of commodities, but the latest chapter in the oldest story on Earth. Let us return one final time to the beginning, to the Cambrian Ocean with its five-eyed predators and its upside-down animals and its experimental body plans, to the moment when life first discovered the full range of its own possibilities, to the age of experimentation, when the rules had not yet been written and anything seemed possible. That age is gone. The wild diversity of the Cambrian has been filtered, shaped, constrained, and sculpted by 500 million years of evolution, extinction, and ecological change. Of the many body plans that existed in the Cambrian, only a fraction survived. Of the many ecological strategies that were tried, only the most effective and most flexible persisted. Of the many lineages that flourished for millions of years, only those that happened to be in the right place with the right adaptations at the right time, or that were simply lucky enough, survived the great crises that punctuated the history of life. The result is the modern world, a world of extraordinary complexity and diversity, but a world that represents only a subset of the possibilities that once existed. The organisms alive today are the survivors, the inheritors, the latest generation in a lineage stretching back to the Cambrian. They are remarkable, they are diverse, they are in their own ways as strange and wonderful as anything that lived in the ancient ocean. But they are also the outcome of a process of selection and elimination that has discarded far more than it has preserved. For every lineage alive today, there are dozens, perhaps hundreds of extinct lineages that flourished for millions of years and then vanished, leaving behind only fossils and questions. The world we live in is richer for the survivors, but it is poorer for the lost. The study of the ancient ocean is, in the end, an act of remembrance, a way of honoring the lost as well as celebrating the surviving. A way of acknowledging that the world we inhabit is the product of a long, complex, and often painful history, a history of extraordinary creativity and devastating loss, of remarkable success and quiet extinction, of endless change and remarkable persistence. The Cambrian creatures were not failures, they were pioneers. They were the ones who first explored the space of biological possibility, who first tested the rules that would govern animal life for 500 million years. Apobinia, with its 5 eyes and its improbable proboscis, was as real and as vital as any creature alive today. Hallucigenia, with its defensive spines and its flexible legs, was as well adapted to its world as any modern organism is to its own. Anomalocaris, the great predator of the Cambrian Sea, was as magnificent and as fearsome as any apex predator that has existed before or since. They are gone, but they were here. They lived in a real ocean under a real sun, in a world as complete and as vivid as our own. They were part of the great experiment that produced, eventually, every living thing on Earth today. Their story is our story. Their ocean, however strange and alien, was our origin. The forgotten ocean is forgotten no more. It lives in the fossils that preserve its creatures, in the genes that carry its legacy, in the ecological relationships that echo its dynamics. It lives, most of all, in the extraordinary diversity of life that exists today, diverse, wonderful, and irreplaceable, the final product of 500 million years of the greatest experiment ever conducted. The ocean remembers, even if we have forgotten, and it is time for us to remember too. Every creature that ever swam through the ancient sea, every body plan that was tried and tested and either preserved or discarded, every ecological relationship that was established and refined over millions of years, all of it contributed to the world we have inherited. The fish that feeds on coral reefs carries the legacy of Cambrian chordates. The squid that hunts in the midnight zone carries the legacy of Cambrian mollusks. The crab that scuttles across the seafloor carries the legacy of Cambrian arthropods. And the human mind that wonders at all of this, that asks these questions and seeks these answers, carries the legacy of the Cambrian nervous system, the first nervous systems assembled in the ancient ocean that made possible the capacity for thought, curiosity, and understanding. We are the ocean's children. We are the heirs of the Cambrian. And the story that began in those ancient, alien seas 500 million years ago continues still. In the deepest trenches of the modern ocean, creatures live and die in darkness that no sunlight has ever reached. On the most remote coral reefs, species interact in relationships that have been refined over millions of years. In the open ocean, vast communities of plankton drift on currents that have circulated since before the first fish existed. The ocean is alive as it was in the Cambrian, as creative, as dynamic, as full of possibility. The experiment continues. The ocean is still writing its story, and each generation of creatures, from the 5-eyed wonders of the Cambrian to the singing whales of the modern sea, adds another chapter to the oldest, strangest, most magnificent story ever told. The story of life, the story of the forgotten ocean.